The frost hasn't lifted off the tree line yet. 30 horses come over the white slope, breath steaming, and somewhere in the middle of them, one saddle begins to slide sideways. No scream. Just the ground up, the sky turning over, and 3 long seconds where a woman lies staring at a winter morning, unable to remember what lungs are for. The girth didn't break, it was cut and straight. Cut exactly where no rider would ever see it from above. Hooves come back too soon, one set, not 30. Someone left a horse mid-stride in a way 3 separate witnesses would later describe the same impossible way, and not one of them would call it the movement of a man. At the back of the pack, a woman with iron rings braided through her hair goes very pale. Not with guilt, with confusion. In the fallen woman's pocket, a worn copper coin is still warm, then a hand opens above the frost. She almost didn't go. That's the truth of it. Not the version people tell later. Not the version with fate stitched through it like gold thread through cheap wool. The truth is smaller than that. The truth is a girl standing in a doorway with her coat half buttoned, telling herself she had better things to do. She didn't. Senna Wren had exactly one good dress, one bad knee from a fall 3 winters back, and a brother named Tobin, who wouldn't stop coughing long enough to let her forget why she was going in the first place. 22 years old. 4 years past which most girls in Asheville got claimed. 2 years past which her mother stopped pretending that didn't matter. So no, she didn't want to go to the claiming feast at Blackthorn Hold. She went anyway. Because Tobin asked her. Because Tobin never asked her for anything. Not once in 19 years, and this one time he had, quietly between coughs, and she hadn't been able to say no to that. Because the physician had used a word she didn't like the shape of. Because Blackthorn's kitchens fed better than the whole of Asheville combined. And if she stood in a receiving line for one evening and let some steward look her over and find her unremarkable, well, that was a price. She could pay it. Small price. Small girl. Small life, she told herself, packing the one good dress into a bag that had belonged to her mother before her ex. That wasn't true either. Nothing about what came next was small. The road to Blackthorn took 6 hours by cart. Senna spent most of it not talking, which was its own kind of relief. The woman beside her, older, sharp-chinned, smelling faintly of lavender water gone stale, tried twice to start a conversation about lineage registries. Gave up both times. Senna watched the hills instead. Gray stone walls, sheep the color of old snow. A crow that followed the cart for almost a mile before it got bored and left. The way most things eventually got bored and left, in Senna's experience. By the time the towers of Blackthorn Hold came into view, the sun was low and orange and unconvinced of itself, like it wasn't sure it wanted to set on whatever was about to happen inside those walls. Senna wasn't sure either. She had 1 coin left in her purse. She'd been saving it for bread for the walk home because that was the plan. Go, stand in line, be overlooked, walk home, buy bread on the way. Simple plan. Clean plan. Plans like that never survive contact with a gate. The gate was chaos. Not violent chaos, festival chaos. The kind where everyone smiles too hard and nobody can find where they're supposed to stand. Banner. A juggler badly drunk or badly trained, possibly both, dropping wooden pins in a rhythm that made children scream delight. A boy maybe 14 meant to be guarding an offering bowl near the gate, except he'd abandoned his post entirely to watch the juggler instead. The bowl was for alms. Half full of copper. Nobody watching it at all. Senna almost walked past it. Except there was a man sitting against the gatehouse wall just past the bowl, and something about him slowed her feet down before her mind caught up with why. He wasn't begging. That was the strange part. He wasn't holding out a hand, wasn't rattling a cup, wasn't doing any of the small performances beggars do to earn a stranger's guilt. He was just sitting, watching the courtyard the way a man watches weather he can't do anything about. Cloak that used to be good wasn't anymore. Hair the color of wet bark, unbrushed, falling into eyes he didn't bother clearing it from. A smear of dried mud along one cheekbone. He hadn't wiped it off, hadn't tried. She had 1 coin, she crouched anyway. Don't ask her why. She couldn't have told you why, not then. Not for months after. Some decisions don't come from thinking. They come from somewhere underneath thinking. Some older part of a person that moves before permission is granted. She pressed the coin into his palm. His hand was warm. That surprised her more than anything else that night would surprise her. And a great many things were about to surprise her. For your trouble, she said. Which was foolish. What trouble could a single copper coin possibly fix? She heard the words leave her mouth and wanted them back immediately. Wanted to fold them up small and hide them somewhere no one would find them. Too late he looked up. Eyes the color of river ice in winter, pale at the rim. Going darker toward the center like something underneath hadn't decided yet whether to rise. They moved across her face slowly, carefully. The way a man reads something he isn't sure he's allowed to read. He didn't blink. I will remember it. His voice didn't match the rest of him. Low, even educated in some way the mud and the cloak weren't. She stood up too fast. Her knee, the bad one, buckled slightly, the way it did when she hadn't eaten enough. She caught herself against the gatehouse wall and pulled her hood forward and walked into the hall without looking back. She should have looked back. She didn't know that yet. The great hall of Blackthorn was the largest room Senna had ever stood inside. Ceiling lost somewhere above the reach of torchlight. Iron chandeliers shaped like antlers, thick candles burning in them. Wax dripping slow gold threads toward a floor polished smooth by 3 centuries of boots. 3 long tables running the length of the room like ribs. At the far end, one tapestry. Black wolf, standing over a broken crown. She'd heard about that tapestry her whole life. Nothing had prepared her for the size of it. The unclaimed women sat at second table, nearest the door. Not the point of the evening. Everyone understood that without being told. The point of the evening sat at the front on a dais carved from a single slab of dark oak, an empty chair beside a throne shaped like a wolf mid-stride, the Alpha King's seat empty. She'd heard about him her whole life too. Rurik of Blackthorn. Took the throne at 23 by killing the cousin who tried to take it first, 9 years unchallenged since. Never smiled in public, or so the stories went. His wolf, the largest anyone alive had seen. Refused 3 claiming feasts already. This one, apparently, hadn't been his choice at all. They said he was furious it was happening. Senna reached for bread and privately decided she would leave before the second course. The woman beside her, younger than the lavender water one from the cart, nervous laugh, hands that would still, elbowed her gently. Eat slow, the woman said. He hasn't come in yet, I noticed. He might not come at all. Lucky him. The woman laughed, a small startled sound, like she hadn't expected to be amused tonight of all nights. You don't want to be claimed. I want to go home before the snow. Which was true and incomplete. The fuller truth sat underneath it, the way most truth things do. Senna had watched her mother get claimed. Twice, watched her get set aside. Twice, and somewhere around her 12th birthday she'd made a decision so quiet even she hadn't noticed making it. She would do neither. Not the claiming. Not the setting aside, not any of it. The woman opened her mouth to say something else then. Her eyes lifted past Senna's shoulder. The whole hall went silent at once. You can feel a room reorient itself when an alpha walks into it. The candle flames don't move. But something in the air does. Something under the air. Senna turned anyway. Because she was 22. Because she was foolish enough to think she needed to see this for herself. He stood at the great doors. Hadn't taken a single step past them yet. Black coat, closed to the throat. No ornament, no chain of office, no crown. 2 warriors plain-faced and watchful, one beta with a face like a worn shield. She'd learn his name later. Garrick, and learn it meant something to trust that face more than most. Rurik's still of wet bark. His cheekbones were still sharp. There was no mud on his face anymore. Her stomach dropped somewhere past the floor and kept falling. Because she understood. All at once, the way you understand a held breath the second before it becomes a scream. She had given her last coin to the Alpha King. He had been sitting outside his own gate, in a dirty cloak, watching his own feast walk past him like he was furniture, and she had crouched down and called him trouble. His eyes found her across the length of the hall and did not move away. She sat down slowly, bread dry in her mouth, suddenly enormous. Suddenly impossible to swallow. His gaze didn't follow her when she sat. He simply walked the length of the hall, at the pace of a man with nowhere he needed to be and an entire kingdom waiting for him to get there anyway. He didn't look at the unclaimed women, didn't look at the dais, didn't look at anyone until he reached the wolf throne and didn't sit sold, he said. A woman rose from the front table. Beautiful the way a sword is beautiful. Narrow, polished. Sharp at every edge that mattered. Hair the color of pale wheat, braided through with iron rings. Green dress cut to show off a heritage pendant the size of a thumb. Senna knew the name before he finished saying it. Isolde Vantry. Every village she'd passed through on the road here had named her the obvious choice as next Luna. As good as decided already. My king, Isolde said, and there it was, the small triumphant note, the sound of a woman who has just been chosen, a room full of witnesses. Rurik didn't sit. Did you arrange the alms bowl at the gate this evening? A pause. Small, almost nothing. My king, the alms bowl. The boy meant to guard it. The beggar who's been sitting beside it since noon. I don't understand the question. Then you didn't arrange it? No, my king. Good, Rurik said. He hadn't raised his voice, not once, hadn't moved his hand, hadn't leaned forward, hadn't given the moment a single ounce of theater. And yet the entire hall understood, all at once, the way a room understands weather changing, that something had just happened. That Isolde Vantry had failed a test she hadn't known was being given. Senna stared very hard at her bread. She did not look up again for the rest of the meal. She was summoned, of course. She had spent the length of the soup course actually hoping, the way you hope a storm passes over the Platem village instead of yours, that she'd imagined the whole thing. That his eyes had found the doorway behind her. That the test had been meant for someone else, and her coin had simply landed in the bowl the way a leaf lands in a stream. Accident. Nothing more. The man who came for her had a face like a worn shield and the exact patience of someone who has collected women from many tables in his life. Mistress, he said, His Grace your attendants. Senna. He blinked. Once, not mistress, she said. Senna. He agreed, perfectly even. His Grace requests your attendance, she rose. Because there wasn't a version of this where she didn't. She walked the length of the hall under the weight of the largest crowd she'd ever stood in front of and tried, with limited success, to remember how legs were supposed to work. He was waiting in a small anteroom off the dais. Door open. 2 guards outside it, no one standing at a narrow window. Looking down at the courtyard where she'd crouched in front of him 3 hours ago, he turned when she entered. The mud was gone. The cloak was gone. Hair clean pushed back from a face that hadn't changed underneath any of it. Same eyes, river ice. Going darker toward the center. You didn't bow, he said. I noticed something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile. The place where a smile starts, before a man decides whether to let it through. I owe you a coin, he said. He reached into his coat, produced it. Her copper thin from handling. He'd carried it, she realized, watching him set it down on the windowsill between them. From the gate, to the dais, to this room, 3 hours in his pocket. She turned it once between her fingers. That was a test, she said, for her, for several of them. Was I one of them? No. She waited for more. He didn't offer any. Why not? Because you weren't on the list. He said it plainly, simply the way a man reports the weather. It took her a moment to understand what he'd said. And it was, she would think later, the single most dangerous sentence anyone had said to her in 22 years of living. There is a list, she said, slowly, testing the shape of it in her own mouth. There is, and I'm not on it. You weren't. He but her catch it. Didn't look away. Something moving underneath the stillness of his face, a muscle in his jaw, a fraction of distance he hadn't yet closed. A thing he was working very hard to keep quiet, my king. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that and slightly suspicious of it. I've given you my last coin. I've walked into your hall. I've stood in front of your entire court. If you brought me here to tell me I wasn't on a list, that's fine, acceptable. If you brought me here for any other reason, I would like to know it now. He took 1 step closer. Not 2, I brought you here, he said, to apologize. Pause. If you're still willing, stay, he said. I'm about to tell you the part I've never managed to say correctly to anyone. Silent. Stay, he said. He didn't give her the list that night. Told her there was one. Told her she was on it now. Told her he'd explain everything in the morning in the library, and something about the way he said morning made it clear. This wasn't a promise he intended to break. Then Garrick, the beta with the worn shield face, escorted her to a guest chamber 3 times the size of her mother's cottage, with a fire already burning in the hearth like someone had known hours ago she would end up needing it. She didn't sleep. She sat by the fire and watched it burn down to red coals and turned the coin over and over between her fingers until the metal warmed from her own hand instead of his. Because that's what a person does. When the world tilts sideways without warning. You reach for the smallest, most solid thing in front of you, and you hold on to it like it might explain everything if you just turn it enough times. It didn't, but by the time the candles guttered, she'd assembled most of the pieces anyway. He'd been at the gate for hours. He'd watched her walk in, he'd known her name before Garrick asked for it. Hadn't needed to ask Garrick to go find out who the woman in the green hood was. He'd already known. Which meant none of this was chance. Which meant she needed to stop pretending, even to herself in the dark with a dying fire, that any part of tonight had been an accident. The library at Blackthorn Hold was not what a person expected from a Wolf King's fortress. Warm, honey-colored oak walls, floor layered thick with furs. 3 tall windows facing east, so the morning sun came through unfiltered and landed square across a long reading table in the center of the room, where someone, Rurik as it turned out, had already laid out a single sheet of paper. Wait for her. She crossed the room slowly. He was seated in a chair by the eastern window. Didn't stand when she entered, didn't greet her, just gestured once at the table, let her find it herself. 46 names written in a clean scribe's hand, every name but one crossed out, some crossed cleanly. A single line, efficient, done without ceremony. Some crossed twice, the second stroke pressed harder into the paper, almost angry, like the first line hadn't made the point. A few had notes in the margin. Different handwriting, sharper. Pressed down hard enough to nearly tear the page. Cruel to her sister, one note said. Beats her horses, said another. Spoke to a beggar like he was furniture. Her stomach turned over slowly reading that last one. The single name that hadn't been crossed out sat at the very bottom of the page, hers. It was added 2 weeks ago, Rurik said. By whom? She asked. Though she already knew the answer, some part of her had known it since the courtyard. By me. You've been to my village 3 times. She sat down, because her knees had done the treacherous thing again, and there was no dignity left to protect by staying upright. The council ordered the feast, he said, after a silence long enough that she thought he might not finish the sentence at all. They've been ordering it for 2 years, I refused. This summer they sent me this. 46 daughters of 46 seps houses. I was given to understand that I would attend and choose, or I would be challenged. By whom? Whoever the council decided to send. She looked at the list again, at the small furious handwriting in the margins. You went to 46 villages, 43. I'd already met 3 of them and you crossed off every name. Yes, and then you added mine, yes, and then you sat at your own gate. Dressed as a beggar. To see who would walk past you. I sat at the gate, he said, very carefully, each word set down like something fragile to see if I'd been wrong. She looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the eastern window, at anything that wasn't her face. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, very still, too still. Wrong how? Wrong about you. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. She would learn, in the weeks that followed, that this was the thing about Rurik of Blackthorn. When something cost him, really cost him, he went quieter, not louder. The bigger the admission, the smaller the voice carrying it. Wait long enough and he would give you the rest. Push, and he would close like a door built to survive a siege, so she waited. My wolf, he said eventually. Still facing the window, decided, in your father's barn. I don't understand, I was hunting boundary markers. Territory dispute on the northern edge, nothing that concerned you. You came out at dusk to feed a sick fox kit someone had left orphaned near the fence line. Her breath caught. She remembered that fox, small, half-starved, one ear torn. She'd fed it scraps for 2 weeks before it was strong enough to run. She hadn't seen anyone. Hadn't felt watched. I didn't know your name, he said. My wolf didn't care. Your wolf decided what? He looked at her then, not a glance. A full turn of his head, his eyes on hers, pale ice going dark at the center. And something in his face she hadn't seen there yet, not in the hall, not at the gate, not in the anteroom, something close to fear. That I was finished. She didn't know what to do with her hands. Put them flat on the table, on either side of the only uncrossed name. Stared at the paper, because if she looked up at him, if she let herself actually look at him, she was going to do one of several things and she genuinely didn't know which one yet. Laugh. Cry, run, stay. Outside, far below, someone was training horses, in the lower courtyard. A bell rang somewhere in the fortress. A bird argued with another bird on the windowsill, an argument that had apparently been going on for some time and showed no sign of ending soon. My king, she said. Rurik, Rurik. The library held very still. You wanted to know, she said, whether you'd been wrong, yes. So you sat at your own gate in a dirty cloak, yes, and I walked up and gave you a coin. You did, and called you trouble. There it was again. The small, involuntary thing at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't fighting it this time. You did that as well, he said. She picked up the list, folded it in quarters, didn't hand it back to him, tucked it into the front of her dress against her heart because it was hers now. Because if a king could keep her coin in his pocket for 3 hours without asking permission, she could keep his list against her chest for the rest of her life. All right, she said. He waited. All right, she said again, because apparently some things needed saying twice before they became true. I'm going to need a great deal more information than this, she said. But not now. Not now, he agreed. She left the library. She did not look back this time either, but for a very different reason than before. Word travels fast through a castle full of people with nothing to do but watch. By that evening, everyone in Blackthorn Hold knew that the Alpha King had spent his morning alone in the library, with a woman from a village most of them couldn't have found on a map. That she'd walked out of it with something folded against her chest, and a look on her face like she'd survived a fall from a great height. Isolde Vantry heard about it before the midday meal ended. Senna wouldn't learn the details of that conversation till much later. From Garrick, who had a talent for standing very still in rooms and being underestimated. But the shape of it went something like this. A cousin of Isolde's, breathless, finding her in the solar. "My lady, you should know the village woman, the one from the gate." He took her to the library. "Alone this morning, and Isolde," setting down her needlework with a precision that suggested her hands wanted to do something else entirely. "Which library?" "The eastern one." A long silence. Then very quietly, "Get me the lineage records for Ashvale district." Tonight, that was the first thread pulled. Senna wouldn't feel it tighten for 2 more days. But it was already moving, already working its way through the castle's underground network of ambition and old grudges, long before she understood there was a threat at all. Tobin found out about the coin from a traveling peddler 3 days later, back home in Ashvale, and immediately declared the funniest thing he'd heard in his life, cough or no cough. He didn't know that yet, of course. That was still ahead. What was happening in Ashvale, while Senna sat in a fortress 2 counties away learning she'd apparently been chosen by a king's wolf in a barn 9 months prior, was much smaller and much more urgent. Tobin's cough had gotten worse. Their mother, a woman named Isolde, though nobody in the village had called her that in years, just Mistress Wren or worse, the things people said when they thought she couldn't hear, sat by his bed each night, listening to it rattle in his chest and doing math she'd been doing for months. How much coin left? How many more weeks of tinctures they could afford? How much longer before the choice stopped being about comfort and started being about survival? She hadn't told Senna the full truth before she left for the feast. Hadn't it told her the physician had used the word consumption with a particular weight, the weight of a man who had said that word to families before and watched what came after. She'd let Senna believe this was about food, about the chance of Blackthorn's kitchens, about being seen and passed over quietly, coming home with nothing lost and nothing gained. She hadn't told her because she was afraid that if Senna understood how bad things were, she'd do something that put herself in danger to save her brother. She didn't yet know how right that fear would turn out to be. Just not in the way she'd imagined. Back at Blackthorn, the days that followed moved strangely for Senna. Slow in some places, fast in others, like time itself couldn't decide what pace suited the situation. She was given a chamber of her own, not the guest room from the first night, but something further along the same corridor closer to the family wing, which she stood, without anyone explaining it, was itself a kind of statement. New clothes. Simple at first. Wool well made, undecorated. She suspected correctly that this restraint was deliberate. Rurik hadn't dressed her up like a doll for display. He dressed her warmly, practically like someone he intended to keep. She was not, however, given peace. The unclaimed women who remained, most had gone home by the second day, understanding without needing to be told that the matter had already been decided, watched her in the halls with expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Isolde Vantry did neither. Isolde watched her the way a hawk watches something on the ground it hasn't decided is worth the dive yet. They passed each other twice in those first days. Both times in silence. Both times with Isolde's eyes tracking the length of a corridor, saying nothing, offering nothing, giving away Isolde as much as she wanted to give away, which was to say, nothing at all. Senna understood, without anyone telling her, that whatever came next would come from that direction. She just didn't know when. She spent one gray afternoon in the stables, if only to have somewhere to put her hands that wasn't a book she wasn't actually reading. That was where she first met Ash. A soft-eyed gray mare, gentle in a way most horses in a king's stable weren't required to be, standing quietly in the last stall with her nose pressed against the wood like she was waiting for someone specific. The stable boy, no older than 12, told her the mare's name without being asked. Told her too, in the offhand way children tell you things that adults have decided are too sad to say directly, that Ash used to belong to somebody. The king's sister. Before what? Senna asked. The boy just shrugged and went back to mucking out the stall next door. The way children do when a question has wandered somewhere they aren't allowed to follow. Senna filed it away. One more thing folded against her heart, next to the coin and the list. She didn't know yet how much that small stable boy shrug would come to matter. On the 4th morning, Rurik found her in the library again. She'd started going there on her own, drawn by the eastern light and the quiet, and if she was honest with herself, the small stubborn hope that he might come find her there. He didn't say anything at first. Just crossed to the window, looked out at the courtyard the way he seemed to look at everything, like a man taking inventory of a kingdom that might disappear if he stopped watching it. "You're troubled," she said. "I'm always troubled. It comes with the chair." The empty one or the actual one? Something at the corner of his mouth again. Both currently. She set down the book she hadn't really been reading. "Say it." He was quiet a moment. "The council will move against you," he said. Soon. I don't know how yet. I know it's coming the way I know weather is coming, in spoons before it's in the skies. Isolde, and others. She's not alone in this, and she was never going to be quiet about losing. You could send me home. He turned from the window. I could, he said. I won't. Why not? Because I spent 9 months deciding. You were the answer to a question I didn't know how to ask properly. I'm not going to undo that because it's inconvenient for a woman with iron rings in her hair. She laughed, surprised out of herself, the sound catching her off guard as much as it seemed to catch him. That's the least romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. I'm told I have a talent for it. Who told you that, Garrick? Repeatedly, usually while sighing. She was still smiling when the humor in his face faded, replaced by something heavier, the Senna. Whatever comes. I need you to understand it isn't about whether I've chosen you. That part is finished. It's about whether the choosing survives contact with people who've spent their whole lives believing they're owed a different outcome. She held his gaze. Then let them try, she said. She meant it as bravado, the kind of thing you say to sound braver than you feel. She didn't yet know how soon she'd be tested on it. The lineage records arrived at Isolde's chambers on the 5th night, carried by a clerk who clearly wanted no part of whatever was happening and left as quickly as decorum allowed. Isolde read them by candlelight, alone for almost 3 hours. Ashvale District, sparse record. The village was small, its record-keeping inconsistent even by the modest standards of outlying territories, but there was enough. A woman named Isolde Wren, claimed once 24 years prior by a lord from the Western Holdings, set aside within the year. No explanation recorded, though margin notes from the presiding clerk hinted at something the records themselves didn't spell out directly. Claimed a second time 3 years later. Set aside again, faster this time. And then, this was the part Isolde read 3 times, slowly making certain she understood it correctly. A gap in the paternal line for the younger of Isolde's 2 children, a father listed as unknown. Isolde set the papers down very careful, her hands. Sat in the candlelight for a long time, thinking through what she now held and how precisely she intended to use it. A woman with no confirmed father. Twice set aside mother. Not damning on its own, pack law wasn't so cruel as to punish children for choices made around them. But it was a thread. And Isolde Vantry had learned a long time ago that a thread, pulled at the right moment in front of the right witnesses, could unravel a great deal more than the fabric it was attached to. She began drafting the writ that same night. Seth didn't know any of this yet. What she knew on the 6th day was that Tobin's letters had stopped coming as regularly, and the last one, 3 lines, in handwriting shakier than she remembered, had mentioned the physician's visit without saying what the physician had said. She sat with that letter for a long time. Rurik found her with it still in her hands, hours later in the library. The candle beside her burned down further than she'd noticed. What's wrong? Nothing, my brother, he's ill. It's probably nothing, you don't believe that? No. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat not beside her exactly, but close enough that the distance felt intentional in its smallness. I'll send my own physician to Ashvale, he said. Today before the hour's out. You don't have to do that, I know. You barely know me. I've known you 9 months, he said. You've known me 4 days. I'm aware the arithmetic is unbalanced. I intend to spend considerable time correcting it. She looked at him, really looked the way she hadn't quite let herself since the courtyard, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Not resolve exact. Something closer to permission. Permission to let herself hope this was real. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until the physician's report comes back then, if there's cause for it, thank me properly. There wasn't cruelty in it, just the particular honesty of a man who'd learned not to make promises about outcomes he couldn't control. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. The physician's report came back 2 days later. Consumption confirmed, early. Treatable, with the right care and the right coin behind it. More coin than Ashvale had ever seen in one place, arriving now by Rurik's order, along with the physician himself, installed in the Wren cottage for as long as the treatment required. Senna read the letter from her mother 3 times. Isolde's handwriting, usually careful, wavered across the page in places. Relief did that to people. Made even steady hands shake. She folded the letter and held it against her chest, next to the place where the list still sat, folded in quarters, against her heart. 2 documents now. One a record of everyone Rurik had rejected to find her. One a record of what it cost to keep the people she loved alive. She was starting to understand slowly, painfully, the actual weight of what she'd walked into. Not a negotiation in love and power, conducted in a language she was only beginning to learn. On the 8th day Isolde made her move. Not publicly. Not yet. She found Senna in the corridor outside the kitchens where Senna had gone in search of tea after a sleepless night, and she was not alone. 2 cousins flanked her. A third figure, a man Senna didn't recognize, holding a scroll, stood slightly behind, the way subordinates peasants stand when they know they're about to be useful and slightly ashamed of it. Mistress Wren, Isolde said. The word mistress did the same work in her mouth that the word beggar had once done in Senna's, a small deliberate cruelty wrapped in courtesy. Senna set down her tea. We have a matter of lineage to discuss, Isolde said. Pack law, she continued, requires that any woman presented before an alpha king at a claiming feast be of confirmed pack lineage. Your village has no record of your father. Your mother was claimed and set aside. Twice, she gestured. The man with the scroll stepped forward. We've prepared the forms, Isolde said. You'll withdraw from consideration. You'll leave Blackthorn before nightfall. The king will be informed you grew homesick. No one need suffer for it. An elegant trap, Senna would think later. The forms were real. Pack law on lineage verification was real. Rurik himself could likely override it. But doing so publicly would suggest he was bending the law for a woman whose blood was, in fact, in question. And Isolde knew that as well as anyone in the castle. Senna looked at her for a long moment. She hadn't slept properly in 3 nights. She was holding a cup of tea gone lukewarm. She was 22 years old, and she had given her last coin to a king who had carried it in his pocket for 3 hours before returning it. And she was, it turned out, standing in that corridor with Isolde's iron-ringed hair catching the torchlight, not remotely in the mood to be managed. Lady Isolde, she said. My mother was claimed and set aside twice. That's not a lineage problem. That's a judgment problem. She set down her tea. The judgment didn't run in the family, she said. I've made better choices than my mother already. I'm about to make another one now. She walked past Isolde, past the cousins, past the man with the scroll who lowered it slightly, as if uncertain what to do with a rejection that hadn't followed the script. She didn't look back. She went to find the king. She found him in the lower courtyard watching a thin stable boy put young mare through her paces. Not Ash this time, a younger animal, more skittish, less sure of itself. He turned before she'd fully crossed the yard. Saw her face. Didn't ask what had happened. Just waited the way he seemed to do with most things, patient in a way that made space for whatever she needed to say. Isolde Vantry, Senna said, is in the kitchen corridor, with a lineage writ and 2 cousins, attempting to have me legally withdrawn from consideration on the grounds that my ancestry can't be verified. She's given me until nightfall. Rurik was quiet for a moment. Did she? He said. Very softly, she did. He turned to Garrick, who had appeared, as he tended to, at his shoulder without announcing himself. Find the council clerk, Rurik said. I want the original writ Isolde signed when she accepted her own invitation to this feast. There's a clause on the 3rd page, good faith conduct. I want it read aloud at the evening meal, my king. And Garrick, make certain Lady Isolde is seated in the front row when it's read. Garrick's worn shield of a face did something it hadn't done all week. It almost smiled. The evening meal that followed was, by every account Senna heard afterward, one of the quieter humiliations the Blackthorn court had witnessed in years. Quiet in volume. Deafening in effect. The clerk read the clause without embellishment. Without commentary. Simply the words themselves, plain and binding. Any candidate who, having accepted invitation to the claiming feast, subsequently acts to undermine or falsely disqualify a fellow candidate through means not sanctioned by formal challenge, forfeits standing before the council for a period of no less than 1 year. Isolde sat through the entire reading with her spine perfectly straight and her face perfectly composed. Senna almost admired the discipline of it. Almost, she didn't fool herself into thinking this was over. A woman like Isolde Vantry did not absorb a public correction and simply retreat. If anything, Senna understood, watching the careful blankness of her expression across the hall, that this had only sharpened whatever came next. The lineage writ was withdrawn within the hour. Officially at least. But Senna had learned enough in 8 days at Blackthorn to know that withdrawing a piece of paper and withdrawing an intention were 2 entirely different things. That night, Rurik found her again in the library. He didn't say anything for a while. Just sat at Schafferwertthefing and assist Woodall that had become, without either of them naming it as such, his chair. You handled that well, he said eventually. I told her the truth. That's not the same as handling something with you, he said. It seems to be. She looked up from the book she wasn't reading. She's not finished, Senna said. No. You know that I do. Then why do you look so calm about it? He considered the question with the same care he seemed to bring to everything. Because, he said, I've spent 9 years learning that the people who plan the loudest attacks are rarely the ones who land the deepest wound. Isolde is loud. That worries me less than what I don't yet know is happening quietly, somewhere I'm not looking. Something in his voice saying that made her go still? What do you mean? He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice had dropped into that particular register she was learning to recognize. The one that meant the words cost him more than they let on. There's something in the archive records I haven't told you about yet, he said. Something that predates either of us. I found it 3 years ago and I haven't known what to do with it since Rurik. Not tonight, he said. I need more time before I say it correctly. But soon, I promise you that. She wanted to press, wanted to demand it now, this instant. Whatever thing had put that particular shadow behind his eyes, she didn't. Because something in his face told her this wasn't reluctance. It was fear, and she had learned in 8 strange unraveling days that a man like Rurik of Blackthorn did not fear easily. 2 days passed before the archive came up again. She spent them in a strange, suspended state, half of her still adjusting to a life so different from the one she'd left in Ashvale, that some mornings she woke expecting to hear Tobin coughing in the next room, and instead heard the low murmur of the castle waking around her. The other half circling again and again the shadow she'd seen cross Rurik's face. She used the time to explore carefully. The library first, its shelves organized in a system she was slowly learning to navigate, then the Eastern Gallery, where portraits of past rulers hung in heavy gilt frames, their painted eyes following her down the corridor in a way that made her skin prickle. She stopped in front of one in particular on the second afternoon. An older man. Silver-templed, though something in the set of the jaw suggested a face that had once looked very much like Rurik's own. Dressed in the same unadorned black the current king favored, though this portrait's subject wore a heavier crown, more ornate, the kind a man wears when he still believes ceremony matters. The small brass plaque beneath it read, Aldrich of Blackthorn, 22nd Alpha King, reign of 31 years, Rusik's father. She stood front of that portrait for a long time, studying the painted eyes, looking for whatever resemblance had made her stop walking in the first place. She didn't know, standing there, that she was looking at the answer to a question she hadn't yet learned to ask. That evening, Rurik came to find her in the gallery himself. Garrick had apparently mentioned where she'd spent her afternoon. In the offhand way castle staff seemed to report everything to him without quite meaning to be reporting anything at all. He stood beside her in front of his father's portrait without speaking for a long moment. You have his jaw, Senna said finally, so I'm told. Constman as a compliment, it rarely feels like one. Why not? He was quiet. Because my father, he said slowly, was not a man I understood while he was alive. And I've spent the 3 years since his death understanding him considerably less. She turned from the portrait to look at him directly. This is the archive, she said. Isn't it? He didn't answer right away. Yes, he said finally. Tell me. Not here, Rurik. Not here, he said again. And there was something almost pleading in it. Some crack in the composure she'd come to think of as permanent. Tomorrow the library. I promise you tomorrow, she wanted to argue. Wanted to plant her feet in that gallery corridor and refused to move until he gave her the whole of it. Right there, under his father's painted eyes. She didn't. Because something in his face, some genuine unguarded fear, told her this wasn't him withholding to control her. This was him working up the courage to hand her something he'd carried alone for 3 years. And she understood, standing there, that whatever it was about to change the shape of everything. She barely slept that night. Lay awake in the dark, listening to the fortress settle around her. The particular creak of old stone cooling. A dog barking somewhere in the kennels. The distant muffled sound of the night watch changing shift below her window. She thought about her mother. Twice set aside, no explanation ever offered. Not in 22 years. Not even when Senna had asked directly as a younger girl why her father's name had never once been spoken in their house. Isolde had always deflected. Changed the subject. Once memorably simply walked out of the room and didn't return until the question had clearly been abandoned. Sense had stopped asking, eventually. The way children learn to stop pulling at locked doors. But lying in the dark that night, turning Rurik's fear over in her mind the way she'd turned the copper coin over in her fingers that first sleepless night in this fortress, she felt an old familiar unease stir back to life. Because why would a 3-year-old archive discovery, made by the current king, connect to anything in her family's past unless it did? Unless it already had. Morning came slower than she wanted it to. She was in the library before the sun had fully cleared the eastern windows, sitting in her usual chair, hands folded in her lap because she didn't trust them not to fidget. Rurik arrived not long after. He looked like he hadn't slept much better than she had. Same shadows under the eyes. Same careful stillness in his movements, like a man conserving energy for something that was going to cost him. He didn't sit immediately. Crossed to a locked cabinet along the far wall, one Senna hadn't paid much attention to before, and produced a small brass key from an inner pocket of his coat, inside a single folder, leather-bound, worn soft at the corners from handling. He set it on the table between them. Didn't open it. 3 years ago, he said. Shortly after my father died, I was going his private correspondence. Most of it was nothing, state matters. Old grievances with neighboring holds. The usual weight a king leaves behind for his heir to sort through. He paused, and then I found this. He opened the inside. A single sheet of paper, older than the list Senna had memorized weeks ago. The ink faded to a soft brown, the handwriting different, heavier, more deliberate. The hand of a man used to signing documents that mattered. Another list. Shorter, perhaps a dozen names, most crossed out in the same style as the one she carried folded against her chest, even now clean lines. Some double. A few with margin notes in that same heavy hand. Near the bottom, one name remained uncrossed. Isolt, no surname. Just the name, written and left standing while every name around it had been struck through. Her breath left her all at once. That's my mother's name, she said. Though she already knew. Though some part of her had known the shape of this the moment Rurik unlocked that cabinet. Yes, Rurik said, I don't understand. My father, he said. And his voice had dropped into that quiet register again. The one that meant the words were costing him everything they were worth. Kept a list, 23 years ago. Before he married my mother. Before any of the alliances that shaped the kingdom I inherited. He touched the edge of the page. Didn't pick it up, he'd chosen someone, Rurik said. The same way I chose you. His wolf had decided, the way mine decided, and the name he'd settled on out of every daughter of every house the council presented him, was a woman named Isolt. A commoner. No pack lineage the council found acceptable. Her hands had gone very cold. What happened to her, she said, though she already knew in some deep unspoken place exactly what the answer was going to be. The council refused it, Rurik said. Not publicly. Not the way these things happen now with writs and formal challenges. Quietly. They made it impossible, pressured the match apart through a dozen small cruelties until it simply ended. My father claimed my mother's instead. A political match, suitable bloodline, everyone satisfied except him and Isolt. I don't know what happened to her after, Rurik admitted. The records stop. There's no further mention in anything I've found. Until 3 years ago, when I discovered this folder, I didn't know she'd existed at all. She sat very still. Because she was doing the arithmetic now. The same arithmetic Isolt had done days earlier, poring over lineage records by candlelight, except she was doing it from the other direction. Working backward from a name toward a truth that felt suddenly less like coincidence and more like inevitability. My mother, she said slowly, was and set aside twice, 24 years ago and again 3 years after that. Senna. She never told me why. Not once. Not when I asked as an adult. She'd go quiet, or she'd leave the room. And eventually, I stopped asking because it clearly hurt her too much to answer. She looked up at Rurik. At the portrait's jaw echoed in his own face. At the eyes that had watched her from the courtyard and known, somehow everything she hadn't yet told him. Your father chose my mother, she said, before either of us was born, and the council destroyed it. I don't know that for certain that I told myself. For 3 years, it might be coincidence. A different Isolt. A different life entirely. Do you believe that? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. I haven't believed it since the day I found your barn, Senna. Since the day my wolf decided, in an instant, with no explanation I could, the council, even if they demanded one, that you were finished for me. Some part of me has known since that moment that this wasn't chance. I've simply been too afraid to say it aloud. Save what, she asked, though her voice had gone very quiet now, matching his. That it's happening again, Rurik said. The same story, 23 years apart. A king's wolf choosing a commoner woman, the council will never accept without a fight. Except this time I'm the king holding the pen, and I have to decide whether I'm going to let it happen to you the way it happened to her. Silence stretched between them, long enough that she could hear faintly, the same argumentative bird from days earlier, still relitigating whatever grievance it held against its neighbor on the windowsill. Isolde already tried the lineage writ, she said slowly, working through it as she spoke. She doesn't know any of this. She was working from ordinary suspicion. An unlisted father, a mother claimed twice. She doesn't know there's an actual document connecting our families. No, Rurik agreed. As far as I know, only I've seen this fold. And now you, then who else might? His jaw tightened. That's what frightens me, he said. My father didn't act alone when he destroyed this match 23 years ago. Someone on the council pressured him into it. Someone with enough standing to make an alpha king abandon his own wolf's choice. And if that person, or their successor, their child, whoever inherited that particular ambition, is still sitting on my council today. He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. She reached across the table and touched the edge of the old list. Her mother's name, faded brown ink, 23 years old. I need to write to her, she said. My mother, I need to ask her directly. She's kept this from me my whole life and I think it's time she stopped. She may not want to answer. She may not have a choice anymore, Senna said. Not if the same people who destroyed her chance 23 years ago are still positioned to destroy mine now. Rurik studied her face for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted since he'd opened that cabinet. The careful composure he wore like armor in every other room of this fortress had cracked, just slightly, revealing something underneath that looked almost like relief, as if carrying this alone for 3 years had been its own kind of weight, and setting it down, even partially, even just by speaking it aloud to one other person, had lightened something in his chest. There's something else, he said. She looked up. There's more, the margin notes, he said. On my father's list, I didn't read all of them to you. He turned the page slightly, pointed to a cramped notation beside one of the crossed-out names, written in a third hand, different from his father's, different from whoever had added the harsher second strikes. She leaned closer to read it. Vantry will not accept this. Neither will his son. The room went very still. She repeated, Isolde's family name, Rurik said. Her grandfather sat on my father's council. Her father sits on mine. She felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a feeling she recognized now distantly, from the moment at the gate when she'd first understood who she'd handed her last coin to. The particular vertigo of a world rearranging itself around a fact she hadn't been prepared for. You're saying, she said slowly, that the family trying to destroy my chance now is the same family that destroyed my mother's chance 23 years ago. I'm saying the name is the same, Rurik said carefully. I don't yet know if the reason is the same. That's what I need to find out quietly, before Isolde or her father realize how much ground I've already covered. And if it is the same reason. He met her eyes. Then this was never only about a claiming feast, he said. This is about a family that has spent 2 generations deciding who is and isn't fit to stand beside the throne of Blackthorn. And I intend to find out exactly how far they're willing to go to keep deciding it a third time. She sat back slowly, her hand still resting on the edge of the old faded list. Her mother's name, uncrossed, waiting 23 years for someone to finally ask the question out loud. Outside, the bell rang again in the courtyard below. Somewhere past the eastern window, life in Blackthornhold continued exactly as it had that morning and every morning before. Servants moving through corridors. Horses being led to pasture. The ordinary machinery of a kingdom turning over without any awareness of what had just shifted in this one small sunlit room. But Senna understood, sitting there with her mother's name beneath her fingers, and Rurik's fear finally spoken aloud between them, that nothing about the days ahead was going to be ordinary again. Somewhere in this fortress, a family had already begun preparing to protect a secret 23 years buried, and she had just become the reason it was about to be dug up. The letter to Isolde went out that same afternoon. Senna wrote it 3 times before she let it leave her hands. The first draft was too gentle, a daughter tiptoeing around a wound she didn't want to reopen. The second was too sharp, an accusation dressed up as a question. The third one she barely recognized as her own voice by the time she finished it. Mother, I need you to tell me about a man named Aldrich of Blackthorn. I need you to tell me why. Please don't make me ask twice. She sealed it herself, handed it to the fastest rider in Rurik's service, watched him ride out through the gate. The same gate, she realized with a small cold jolt, where all of this had started 8 days ago. 8 days. It felt like a season, it felt like a decade. It felt, standing there watching dust settle behind a departing horse, like her whole life had been quietly rearranging itself around a truth she hadn't known existed until yesterday morning. She didn't know how long the answer would take to come back. She didn't know it wouldn't matter, because by the time it arrived, everything would already have changed twice over. Isolde Vantry did not take her public correction lying down. Of course she didn't. That would have required a version of Isolde who didn't exist. The lineage writ had been withdrawn, officially, publicly, read out and folded away like a closed matter. Except it wasn't closed, it had never been closed. It had simply gone underground, the way water goes underground when you dam the surface of it, which meant it was still moving. Just somewhere you couldn't see it. Senna felt the pressure of that unseen current for 3 days before it broke the surface again. She felt it in small things. A servant who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. A conversation in the corridor that stopped too abruptly when she rounded the corner. A council member, an older man with a heavy gray beard and eyes like a man doing sums he didn't like the answer to, who bowed to her with exactly the correct depth and not 1 degree more. Something was being planned. She just didn't know what, didn't know when, didn't know that the answer to both questions was already circling closer than she understood. On the 4th day after the letter went out, Garrick found her in the library with an expression she hadn't seen on his worn shield of a face before. Not alarm exactly, something quieter. Dread wearing good manners. "There's to be a hunt," he said. "Tomorrow at dawn traditional." Ahead of the formal claiming. "I know the custom, do you?" The alpha rides, the chosen woman rides beside him, the pack watches, everyone understands what they're watching. "That's the ceremony," Garrick said. "Yes." Something in his tone made her look up from the book she'd been holding without reading. "You're worried?" "I'm careful," Garrick said. "There's a difference, usually, Garrick." He was quiet a moment. Weighing something then. "Lady Isolde has been unusually pleasant these past 2 days. To everyone. Including me. That's a bad sign." "That is the worst possible sign," Garrick agreed. "I've served this family 11 years. I've watched Isolde Vantry lose things before. She does not become pleasant when she's given up. She becomes pleasant when she's already... She becomes pleasant," Garrick said, "when she believes the ending is already decided, whether or not anyone else knows it yet." Senna set the book down slowly. Something cold moved through her, not fear exactly, though it lived close enough to fear to borrow its address. The particular chill of standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, certain there's a step missing somewhere below, unable to see which one. "I'll be at the hunt," she said. "I know," Garrick said. "That's why I'm telling you now." She wasn't a writer, she'd said so plainly, days earlier, when the ceremony was first explained to her, and Rurik had nodded and quietly arranged for the gentlest mare in the stables, the soft-eyed gray she'd already met, already fed apple cores to on quiet afternoons, already grown fond of in the particular quick way you grow fond of a creature that seems to have decided on its own terms to trust you. Dawn came gray and cold and smelling of frost. The pack assembled in the lower courtyard. Perhaps 30 riders, breath fogging in the pale light, horses stamping and blowing steam into the morning. Rurik at the front, dressed for the ride, dark hair pushed back from a face that had gone unreadable in the particular way it went unreadable whenever ceremony demanded it. He caught Senna's eye across the yard once, held it. Something passed between them that didn't need words. Then the horns sounded and 30 horses moved out through the gate at once, and there wasn't room in Senna's head for anything except staying upright in the saddle and remembering to breathe. She felt it about half a mile out. A wrongness. Small at first. A shift in the weight beneath her that shouldn't have been there. Ash felt it too. A good horse. A kind horse. The kind that doesn't panic, just plants her feet and tries to make sense of what's happening beneath her own saddle. The saddle sideways, slow. Wrong. Senna had half a second to understand what was happening before the ground came up to meet her at an angle that knocked every ounce of air out of her chest and left her staring at a white winter sky, unable to remember, for 3 long seconds, how lungs worked at all. She heard hooves before she could see anything clearly. Not the whole pack. One set. Coming fast. Coming wrong, too fast for ceremony, too fast for a rider who hadn't yet understood what had happened. Except he had. That was the thing she'd learn later, piecing it together from Garrick's account, from the way 3 separate riders described the moment independently and arrived each time at the same impossible detail. Rurik hadn't turned his horse, he'd left it mid-stride. Dismount in a single motion that Garrick swore later did not look entirely human. Didn't look like a man climbing off a horse so much, as a man simply choosing to be somewhere else, the physics of it rearranging themselves around his need to get there. He was at her side before the rest of the pack had finished registering that she'd fallen. He didn't touch her, crouched 3 paces away instead. Hands, voice low, controlled, the particular control of a man holding something very still inside his own chest. "Senna, I'm fine," said Senna. "Fine, Rick. I'm fine." The girth was cut, she said. Because her lungs had found air again, finally, and the first thing she wanted to say with it wasn't about herself at all. It didn't break, it was cut. Something moved through his face. Fast, violent. Gone almost before she registered it. "I know," he said. He offered his hand. She took it. Stewed. Brushed frost off her cloak with fingers that had started, now that the danger had passed, to do the thing hands do after danger passes. Shake faintly in a way she refused to acknowledge out loud. The pack had reached them by then. A ring of riders, dismounted, silent, watching. Garrick was already crouched by Ash's saddle. examining the girth strap with the particular focus of a man who has seen enough betrayal in his life to recognize its handwriting on sight. He held it up. The cut was clean, deliberate, positioned somewhere it wouldn't be visible from above. Not the kind of fraying that comes from age or wear, but a cut precise, done with a blade and intention. Rurik looked at the strap, looked at the assembled pack. His eyes moved through the riders slowly, methodically, the way a man counts something he already suspects is going to come short. Found Isolde Vantry at the back of the group, mounted, very pale, her cousins on either side of her looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else on the continent. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "You will be gone from Blackthorn," he said, "before this sun reaches its height." He didn't wait for a reply. Turned back to Senna instead. Looked at Ash, who had recovered her footing, and was now nuzzling anxiously at Sen's shoulder, clearly as unsettled by the morning as everyone else. Looked at the cut strap still in Garrick's hand. Looked finally at Senna herself, then he did the thing she would replay later, more than any other moment of that entire winter. He unfastened his own cloak, the heavy black one, wolf pelt collar, the one that marked him unmistakably as the alpha of Blackthorn to anyone with eyes, and swung it around her shoulders without a word. Fastened the clasp at her throat with hands that were not, she noticed, entirely steady, stepped back, waited. Because he hadn't asked. Because some part of him, she understood this later, turning it over the way she turned over everything that winter, needed her to have the choice of refusing it, even now, as and after everything. She didn't refuse it. Before they rode back through the gate, she reached out and pressed her palm flat against Ash's neck, feeling the mare's pulse still fast beneath the warmth of her coat. "She could have died too," Senna said quietly, not accusing anyone. "Just saying it. The way you say a true thing you need to hear out loud once before you can put it down." Rurik was quiet for a moment. "Ash has already survived losing someone she loved," he said. "I wasn't going to let today be a second time." She looked at him, not understanding yet, and he didn't explain further. Just took the reins gently from the stable boy who'd come running, and walked the mare the rest of the way back himself. She rode the rest of the hunt with his cloak on her shoulders, and her own folded across the saddle in front of her, and every wolf in that pack understood, by the time they returned through the gate, exactly what they'd watched. But something in Senna wouldn't let it rest there. Because a cut girth strap wasn't the same as a lineage writ. A writ was paper, words. Something you could withdraw, fold away, pretend hadn't happened. A cut strap was a blade in someone's hand, deliberate, aimed at her body, at the ground, at whatever damage a fall at speed might do to a person. That wasn't political theater anymore. That was attempted murder, dressed up as an accident, and she understood, riding back through the gate with Rurik's cloak heavy and warm around her shoulders, that whoever had done it had crossed a line Isolde herself, for all her sharp edges, might not have been willing to cross. Which was the thought that kept circling back on her all that afternoon. Because Isolde was proud, vicious when cornered, willing to use paper and pack law and public humiliation as weapons. But murder? Something about it didn't sit right against everything Senna had observed of the woman in 11 days. She didn't say so yet. Didn't have proof of anything. Only the vague, unsettled feeling of a piece not quite fitting the shape of the hole it was supposed to fill. She kept the thought anyway. Tucked it away next to the copper coin and the folded list. Another thing to carry against her chest until she understood what to do with it. Isolde left before midday exactly as ordered. Senna watched from an upper window as a small procession moved out through the gate. Isolde on horseback, 2 cousins flanking her, a modest retinue of servants trailing behind, with what luggage they'd managed to pack in the space of a few hurried hours. Isolde didn't look back at the fortress Senna almost expected her to. Some final glance of fury, some parting shot delivered across the distance, even if no words could carry that far. She didn't. She simply rode, spine straight, chin level, out through the gate and down the winter road, and Senna found herself, oddly, unable to summon the satisfaction she'd expected to feel watching it happen. Because something about the whole scene felt incomplete. A woman who had just been publicly exiled for attempted murder should have looked, at minimum, defeated. Isolde hadn't looked defeated. She'd looked, and Senna turned this over for a long time afterward, trying to name it precisely, confused. Genuinely confused. In a way that didn't fit a woman guilty of what she'd just been accused of. Gif found Senna still at the window an hour later. "You're troubled," he said. "I keep thinking about her face when Rurik gave the order." "Guilty people often look confused when they're caught," Garrick offered. "It's not evidence of anything, I know that. But you don't believe it." She turned from the window. "Garrick, tell me honestly. Did anyone actually see Isolde near the stables this morning? Before the hunt?" Garrick was quiet for a long moment. Tolt said so, he admitted, but she had motive. She had opportunities same as anyone in this fortress. And she'd already tried once with the writ to remove you by other means. By paper, Senna said. Not by blade. Some people escalate. Sense agreed. But I've watched her for 11 days, Garrick. She's proud. Says it's careful. She uses the rules against people, not knives against saddles. This doesn't fit the shape of her. Garrick studied her for a long moment. You want to look at the strap again, he said. Not a question. I want to look at the knife that cut it, Senna said. If anyone still has it, Garrick did have it. He produced it from a locked cabinet in the guardroom that evening, laid across a cloth on the table between them like evidence in a trial. Nobody had officially convened. A short blade. Well made. The kind of knife a person of means might carry, not the crude tool of a desperate servant or an opportunistic stable hand. And there, small, easy to miss, unless you were looking for it, worked into the hilt near the pommel, a mark. A sigil pressed into the metal during forging, the kind of maker's stamp that wealthy families sometimes commission for their household blades. Senna leaned in close, studying it by candlelight. Not the Vantry crest. She'd seen that crest often enough in 11 days to recognize it instantly. A stylized wheat sheaf tied with iron rings echoing the rings Isolde wore in her own hair. This was different. A raven, wings spread, clutching something in its talons that the wear of years had made difficult to identify precisely. Do you recognize this? She asked. Garrick leaned in beside her, went very still. Garrick. I need to check something, he said. Don't move this. Don't tell anyone we found it. He left the room without further explanation, and she sat alone with the knife and the candlelight for the better part of an hour, turning the raven sigil over and over in her mind, waiting. He came back looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 60 minutes. He said, without preamble, belongs to House Corvain. I don't know that name. You wouldn't. It's a minor house. Old but minor. They haven't held real influence in Blackthorn's affairs in decades. Except for one member of the family who has held a seat on the King's Council for longer than I've been alive. She felt the cold settle into her stomach again. The same cold from the library. From the moment Rarik had first shown her his father's list. Which member? She said. Elder Corvain. Garrick said. He sat on King Aldric's council. He's held that seat for over 20 years. She sat back slowly. 20 years. Which meant he had been sitting on that council when Aldric's list existed. When the name Isolde sat uncrossed at the bottom of a page, before someone with enough influence to move a king, had made certain that match never happened. The margin note surfaced in her memory, sharp and sudden. Vantry will not accept this, neither will his sons. Not Corvain. The note in Rurik's father's list, she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke, named the Vantry family as the objection. Not Corvain. Then either the note was wrong, Garrick said, or there were two families opposed. Or he stopped. Or what? She pressed. Or Vantry was the public face of the objection, Garrick said slowly, and someone else was the reason behind it. Nobles do that. Put a loud, proud house out front to take the credit and the blame, while the real architect stays quiet in the background. She felt something click into place, small but solid. The first piece of a much larger structure beginning to reveal its shape. Isolde's confusion, she said, this morning. When Rurik accused her, because she genuinely didn't do it, Garrick said, finishing the thought before she could. Someone used her name. Used the assumption that everyone would blame her, because everyone already believed she had motive. While the actual hand behind the knife, Senna said, sat in a council chamber, 20 years deep in influence, and let a proud, angry woman take the fall for a crime she never committed. They took it to Rurik that same night. He listened without interrupting, a habit she'd come to recognize, the particular stillness he brought to information that mattered, as though moving too quickly might scatter pieces he needed to keep in careful order. When Garrick finished laying out the knife, the sigil, the raven, the name Corvain, Rurik sat for a long moment with his hands pressed flat against the library table, exactly where his father's list had sat weeks before. Elder Corvain, he said finally, has served this council since before I was born. You trust him, Senna said. It wasn't quite a question. I trusted him, Rurik said, past tense as of about 30 seconds ago. Rurik. He looked up. There's something else, she said. The margin note on your father's list, it named Vantry as the family who wouldn't accept the match. Not Corvain. Which means either the note is wrong, or someone made certain it looked like Vantry. She finished. The day someone made certain this morning looked like Isolde. Silence stretched through the library, long enough that the candle between them burned visibly lower, wax pooling and hardening along one uneven edge. 23 years, Rurik said finally quietly, almost to himself. My father destroys a match with a commoner woman. 23 years later, I try to make the same match with her daughter, and someone attempts to kill her during the ceremonial hunt. And both times Senna said, the Vantry name sits close enough to see it. While Corvain sits on the council, Rurik said, watching it happen. Twice he stood. Crossed to the eastern window, though there was nothing to see there now except darkness and the faint glow of torchlight along the outer wall. I need to bring Isolde back, he said. She blinked. What? If she's innocent of this, genuinely innocent, used as a scapegoat the way you're suggesting, then I've just exiled her from her own home for a crime someone else committed, and handed the actual architect of this entire scheme exactly what he wanted. Distance, confusion. Time you exiled her because of a public accusation you had every reason to believe, Sensa said. That doesn't matter, Rurik said. I was wrong, I need to correct it. Quickly. Before Corvain realizes how much ground we've already covered. Isolde's procession hadn't gotten far. A day and a half's ride at most along the winter road, moving slowly with laden carts and reluctant horses. Garrick rode out himself to intercept hers, taking 4 of his most trusted men, moving fast enough that they caught her retinue camped for the night at a modest way station 2 villages north of Blackthorn. What passed between Garrick and Isolde in that conversation, Senna would only ever hear secondhand. Garrick was not a man given to embellishment, and what he reported back was spare, almost clinical in its brevity. She didn't believe him at first, he said, thought it was a trick. Some new cruelty dressed up as mercy, and then I showed her the knife, the raven sigil. She went very quiet. What did she say? Garrick had paused, there's longer than usual. She said she recognized the mark, he finally admitted. Said her grandfather used to keep company with the man who forged blades like it. Said she hadn't thought about that family in years. Which meant, Senna understood, hearing this relayed back at Blackthorn 3 days later, that whatever thread connected Corvain to this conspiracy ran deeper into the old nobility of the kingdom than anyone had yet mapped. Isolde returned to Blackthorn on the 4th day after her exile, and the woman who rode back through the gate was not the same woman who had ridden out. Something in her had shifted. The proud, sharp-edged composure Senna had come to associate with her hadn't disappeared exactly, but it had thinned somehow, worn down to something rawer underneath. They met in the library, an odd choice perhaps given everything, but Rurik had insisted, and Senna understood why once she saw the room arranged. Neutral ground. His father's old cabinet, knock, the folder with the faded list sitting openly on the table. Isolde stopped in the doorway when she saw it. You know, Senna said quietly, don't you? I know some of it, Isolde said. Her voice had lost its usual polish. My grandfather used to speak of a woman his father's generation destroyed. Never a name, just a warning passed down like a family lesson. Never let a king's wolf choose someone the council hasn't approved. It will cost the whole house more than it's worth. Cos crossed to the table. Looked down at the old list. At Isolde's name, uncrossed, waiting 23 years. I don't fully know, she admitted. My grandfather died when I was young. Whatever he understood, he took most of it with him. But I remember one thing clearly. He said the Corvain family had engineered the whole affair, start to finish, and used my family's name as the shield. Because Vantry was already known for pride, for ambition, easy to believe capable of anything. Corvain meanwhile has spent generations cultivating quiet, careful, forgettable respectability. Why, Senna asked. Why did it matter so much to them? A commoner woman 23 years ago. What threat could she possibly have posed to a council seat? Isolde was quiet for a long moment. I don't know the full answer, she said, but I know part of it. My grandfather said the Corvain family's influence has always depended on bloodline purity being treated as sacred, on the idea that commoner blood diluting the ruling line is dangerous, unpredictable, unworthy, whatever language they use to dress up the fear. If a king claims outside that structure and it succeeds, if it's seen to succeed publicly without catastrophe, the entire argument that's protected their family's standing for generations starts to look like superstition instead of law. Rurik's jaw had gone tight. They're not protecting the kingdom, he said slowly. They're protecting a myth that keeps their own house relevant. That would be my guess, Isolde said, though I'll admit, until 4 days ago I believed the myth myself. I believed commoner blood was a genuine risk to stability. I was raised inside the argument long enough to mistake it for truth. She looked at Senna then, directly. For the first time since Senna had arrived at Blackthorn, there was nothing sharp in the look at all. I'm not going to pretend the last 2 weeks were kind, Isolde said. I tried to have you removed through the writ. That was mine. That was real. And I won't dress it up as anything else. But the knife was never me. I think, somewhere underneath my own pride, I've known for 2 weeks that I was being used for something bigger than my own ambition. I just didn't want to look at it directly. The three of them sat with that admission for a long moment. The candle between them had burned down to almost nothing, throwing long, uneven shadows across the old list on the table. I need to know how deep this goes, Rurik said finally. Corm doesn't act alone on a council of 12. If he engineered this twice, 23 years apart, he had help. Allies. People who benefit from the same argument he's protecting. Then we need proof, Senna said. Not suspicion, not a knife with a family sigil that could technically still be explained away. We need something that ties Corvain directly to both events, to your father's list, 23 years ago, and to this hunt days ago. The council archive, Rurik said slowly. What archive? Every council session at Blackthorn is recorded. Minutes kept by whichever clerk serves that term. My father's council records from 23 years ago would still exist, somewhere in the deep archive beneath the east. If Corvain pressured my father into abandoning the match with Isolt, there may be a record of the argument itself. Not a confession, but a pattern, a voice consistently, insistently positioned against commoner claims. They went down that same night. The deep archive beneath Blackthorn's east wing was nothing the warm sunlit library above it. Cold stone. Narrow corridors lined floor to ceiling with document boxes, each labeled in a clerk's careful hair organized by year in a system that had clearly evolved and shifted across several generations of record keepers. Rurik knew roughly where to look. 23 years back put them deep in a section that hadn't been disturbed, judging by the dust, in a very long time. They worked by lantern light for hours. Senna's hands went numb from the cold before they found what they were looking for. A bound ledger, water-stained at one corner, containing the council minutes from the specific season Rurik's father's list had been dated. Rurik read through it first, silent, his jaw tightening incrementally with each page. Then he turned it toward Cessna Isolde, and pointed to a passage near the middle. The handwriting was a clerk's careful transcription, but the words themselves were unmistakably someone's own, quoted directly, the way important objections sometimes were, preserved word for the historical record. Elder Corvain spoke at length regarding the proposed match, stating that the stability of the pack rests upon the certainty of bloodline, and that any deviation, however sentimentally justified, risks unraveling 3 centuries of careful governance. He proposed the matter be resolved quietly, through appropriate pressure upon the parties involved, rather than through open conflict that might embarrass the crown. Senna read it twice. Appropriate pressure, she said quietly. That's not a suggestion. That's instruction. And it's his own words, Rurik said. Recorded. Preserved 23 years old, and it's sitting right here in his own council's minutes. It doesn't prove the knife, Isel said carefully. It proves a pattern of objection. A philosophy. It doesn't prove attempted murder. No, Rurik agreed. But it proves motive that spans 23 years. It proves he's the architect of the argument that destroyed my father's match. And if we can connect that same philosophy, that same pressure, to what happened during the hunt, he stopped. Looked at Senna. We need to know who forged that knife, he said. Not who owned it once, generations back. Who forged it recently and who commissioned the work. That question took 3 more days to answer. Garrick worked it patiently, methodically, moving through the small network of blacksmiths and armorers, who served Blackthorn and its surrounding villages, asking careful questions that didn't reveal too much of what he already suspected. He found the answer in a modest forge on the eastern edge of the territory, an old smith half-blind now, who remembered the commission clearly because it had been unusual. A private order paid well above market rate for a short blade bearing a raven sigil the smith hadn't seen requested in years. Who ordered it? Garrick asked. The old smith had hesitated. Then, weighing whatever loyalty or fear he still carried against whatever Garrick's careful questioning had suggested about the stakes involved, he'd answered. A steward, he said. Middle-aged man. Said he was purchasing on behalf of his employer. Didn't give a name outright, but he wore a raven pin on his collar the whole visit, plain as anything. I assumed the family crest spoke for itself. Garrick brought this back to Rurik and Senna in the library, laying it out with the same spare precision he brought to everything. A steward, Rurik repeated. Not Corvain himself. Elder Corvain wouldn't dirty his own hands with a purchase like that, Garrick said. Not a man who spent 20 years cultivating quiet respectability. He'd send someone else. Someone denayable. Then we need the steward, Senna said. I already have a name, Vic said. It wasn't difficult. Once the smith described him. The one steward in Corvain's household fitting that description, man named Dressler. Been in service to the family for close to 15 years. Bring him in, Rurik said. Quietly, Senna added. If Corvain realizes we're closing in this fast, he'll cut the thread before we can follow it any further. We need Dressler before Corvain knows we're looking. They moved that same night. Garrick and 2 trusted guards intercepted Dressler on the road between Corvain's estate and the nearest village where he'd gone. Ordinarily enough, to arrange supplies for the household. No struggle. No drama. Just a quiet conversation that ended with Dressler agreeing, with visible relief, to accompany them back to Blackthorn. Because that was the thing Senna hadn't expected. Sitting across from the man in a small interrogation chamber the following morning, watching him twist his hands together in his lap. He wasn't defiant, he was terrified. And underneath the terror, something that looked unmistakable like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has quietly, desperately, been hoping someone would eventually make him put it down. I didn't want to do it, Dressler said, before anyone had even finished asking the first question. The knife. The order, any of it. I've served that family 15 years. You don't say no to Elder Corvain. You don't even think about saying no. Tell me what he asked you to do, Rurik said. His voice had gone very level, very careful. The voice of a man holding something enormous perfectly still. He said there was a matter that needed handling before the formal claiming, Dressler said. Said it needed to look like an accident. Said if anyone asked it would point toward Lady Vantry. Everyone already believed she had motive, he said. It would practically handle itself once suspicion started. Did he tell you to cut the girth strap? He told me to arrange for it, Dressler said. I didn't do myself. There's a groom in the Blackthorn stables, I don't know his name, only that Elder Corvain already had some hold over him. Some debt or obligation from before. I delivered the knife. The instructions came from Corvain. I only carried them. Senna sat very still through this, watching the pieces settle into clarity. Did he say why? She asked. Did he ever explain to you why this mattered so much to him? Why a claiming feast justified attempted murder? Dressler was quiet for a long moment. Once he said finally he'd had wine. More than usual, he said something about history repeating itself. Said he'd stopped it once before, decades ago, and he wasn't going to let a king's wolf undo 20 years of careful work over a woman with no lineage worth the paper to record it. The room went very still. He said. Dressler continued, hesitant, watching Rurik's face carefully, that the old king had needed convincing once, and the current one apparently needed convincing twice as hard. Said something about the father having had the sense to listen, eventually, and hoping the son had inherited that particular wisdom along with the throne. Rurik didn't move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into that register Senna recognized now, the quiet one. The one that meant something enormous was moving underneath the stillness. My father didn't have the sense to listen, he said. My father was pressured, cornered, made to believe destroying his own choice was wisdom instead of cowardice. He stood, crossed to the small window of the interrogation chamber, hands clasped behind his back. And Corvain has spent 23 years telling himself a story where that was a victory, he said. Where he saved this kingdom from something, instead of simply protecting his own relevance at the cost of my father's happiness and then this, and then very nearly at the cost of Senna's life. He turned back to face the room. I want him brought before the full councils, he said. Publicly, with everything we have, the knife, the steward's testis, the old council minutes, all of it. That's a significant risk, Garrick said carefully. A public accusation against a council elder based on evidence that's still, forgive me, somewhat circumstantial in places. If it goes wrong. It won't go wrong, Rurik said, because I'm not going to let it be circumstantial. I'm going to give him one chance to explain himself in front of the entire council, and I already know he won't be able to. Word of the confrontation moved through Blackthorn hold like weather, fast, unstoppable. Felt before it was fully understood. Senna spent the 2 days before the council session in a strange suspended state, half of her preparing for whatever came next, the other half still processing everything that had surfaced in the last weeks. Her mother's name on a faded list. A knife with a raven sigil. A steward's trembling confession. A conspiracy that had already claimed one match, 23 years ago, and had very nearly claimed her life trying to prevent a second. She wrote to Isolde again on the first of those 2 days, shorter this time, more urgent. Mother. I know about Aldrich now, I know what the council did. I need you to come to Blackthorn, please, before the council. I need you here. She didn't know if there was time for the letter to reach Ashvale and for Isolde to travel back before the confrontation. She sent it anyway, because some things needed to be tried even when the odds were poor. On the second night, Isolde found her in the library, the same room, Senna reflected. that seemed to have become the emotional center of gravity for everything that had happened at Blackthorn these past weeks. I wanted to say something, Isolde said, before tomorrow. Senna waited. I spent 2 weeks trying to have you removed, Isolde said. I believed, genuinely believed, that I was protecting something worth protecting. My family's standing, the council's trust and bloodline, everything I'd been raised to think mattered. And now? Now I understand I was protecting a lie someone else built, Isolde said, and using my own pride as the mortar to hold it together. I don't expect you to forgive that quickly. I'm not certain I've forgiven myself for it yet either. Senna considered her for a long moment. You came back, she said finally, when Garrick found you on the road. You could have kept writing, gone home. Let Blackthorn sort out its own mess without you. I could have, Isolde agreed. Why didn't you? Isolde was quiet for a moment. Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, she said, I stopped being certain the story I'd been told my whole life was actually true. Once you stop being certain, you can't simply keep riding away from the question. Not if you have any honesty left in you at all. Something in that answer settled something in Senna's chest that she hadn't fully realized was still unsettled. Tomorrow's going to be difficult, Senna said. Tomorrow's going to be worse than difficult, Isolde said. Elder Kerveenzanes has spent 20 years being untouchable. Men like that don't go quietly. Whatever we think we know tonight, be ready for him to know something we don't. She was right, of course. Senna would understand that fully only in hindsight, sitting through the long, grinding hours of the council session the following day. But some part of her felt it coming even that night. Some instinct honed sharp by weeks of watching quiet, careful men move dangerous pieces without ever raising their voices. Because Corvain hadn't survived 20 years on a council by being careless. Because a man who orchestrates the destruction of a king's chosen match, twice, decades apart, doesn't do so without building himself an exit. Some version of deniability. Some story that survives even direct confrontation. Which meant tomorrow wasn't going to be the clean unmasking Senna had allowed herself in weaker moments to imagine. It was going to be a fight. And she didn't yet know what weapons Corvain still had left to use. The council chamber at Blackthorn was smaller than the Great Hall, but somehow it felt heavier. Dark wood paneling. A long table shaped like a horseshoe, 12 seats arranged around it, each carved with the sigil of the house it represented. Elder Corvain's seat sat near the center. Raven, wings spread, carved into the wood behind his chair. The same bird Senna had studied on the hilt of a knife 3 nights ago, now looming over the man himself like a family crest that had finally, after 23 years, come home to roost against him. He didn't look nervous when Rurik entered with Senna, Isolde and Garrick behind him. That unsettled Senna more than anything else that morning. A guilty man should have looked at least a little afraid. Corvain looked, if anything, faintly amused. Rurik didn't waste time on ceremony. He laid the knife on the table first. Then the steward Dressler's written confession, transcribed and signed the previous night. Then the old council minutes, open to the page where Corvain's own words, 23 years old, described the appropriate pressure applied to end his father's match with a commoner woman named Isolde. The chamber went very quiet. Elder Corvain, Rurik said. You'll want to explain yourself now before this council. Corvain studied the items laid before him with unhurried care. Picked up the old council minutes first. Read the passage slowly, as though refreshing a memory rather than confronting an accusation. I did say this, he said finally. Calmly. 23 years ago, I stand by every word of it. The stability of this kingdom depends on bloodline certainty. That was true then. It remains true now. That's not the question, Rurik said. The question is whether you orchestrated the sabotage of a ceremonial hunt, endangering the life of the woman my wolf has chosen. I did no such thing, Corvain said. I gave no order for any knife. I've never met the groom your investigation apparently uncovered. If your steward has implicated me in something he did on his own initiative, I'd suggest you examine his motives for lying rather than mine for supposedly ordering it. He named you directly, Senna said, before she could stop herself. He described your instructions word for word. Corvain turned to look at her properly for the first time since she'd entered the chamber, with an expression she found difficult to read. Mistress Wren, he said, not unkindly. Which was, somehow, worse than if he'd been cruel about it. I understand you've had a difficult few weeks. I understand you've discovered a great deal about your own family's history that must feel enormously significant to you personally. But feelings, however sincere, are not evidence. A frightened steward's confession, extracted under whatever pressure your investigation applied, is not proof of my involvement. It's proof that a desperate man will say a great deal to survive an interrogation. He wasn't threatened, Garrick said, stepping forward. I conducted the questioning myself. He spoke freely. So you say, Corvain replied. Forgive me if the council requires more than the word of the king's own beta, whose loyalty to his king's chosen woman is hardly a secret. Senna felt the ground shifting under the confrontation subtly but unmistakably. Corvain wasn't denying the facts outright, he was reframing them, one careful sentence at a time, turning solid evidence into something that could be dismissed as circumstantial, biased, insufficiently proven. He was good at this. 20 years of council's experience. She glanced at Rurik. Saw the same recognition cross his face, the understanding that this was going to be harder than laying out evidence and watching guilt collapse under its own weight. There's more, Isolde said suddenly. Every head in the chamber turned toward her. My grandfather spoke of this, she said, her voice steadier than expected given everything before he died. He told me the Corvain family had engineered the destruction of a match 23 years ago and used my family's public fit of subjection precisely because everyone already believed the Vantry family capable of that kind of ambition. He said it as a warning. Something passed down quietly within our own household. Corvain's composure flickered, just slightly. The first genuine crack Senna had seen in it all morning. A dying man's recollection, he said, recovering quickly, filtered through a granddaughter's memory of childhood conversations, is hardly council-grade testimony either. Then let's examine something that isn't testimony at all, Rurik said. He produced from within his coat the folder Senna had first seen in the library weeks ago. His father's list, the faded ink, Isolde's uncrossed name at the bottom. He didn't hand it to Corvain, placed it on the table open, for the whole council to see. My father kept this, he said. A list of candidates for his own match, before the council pressured him into abandoning his wolf's actual choice. This is not testimony. This is not a frightened steward's account or a granddaughter's memory. This is my father's own hand, recording his own decision before someone convinced him to betray it. He turned to the council at large, not just to Corvain. I've spent 3 years wondering why my father, a man capable of ruling this kingdom for 31 years without visible weakness, made the one decision in his life that seemed to haunt him most. I found letters after his death that I didn't understand at the time. References to a choice he regretted. A name he never spoke aloud. Not even to me. I understand it now, he said. And I think several of you, looking at the years you've served alongside Elder Corvain, understand a great deal more than you've said aloud as well. Silence stretched through the chamber. Senna watched the council members' faces carefully. Most remained carefully neutral. The practiced blankness of people who had survived years of court politics by revealing nothing prematurely. But one, an older woman near the far end of the horseshoe table, gray-haired with sharp eyes that had watched the entire exchange without once looking away, shifted slightly in her seat. I served alongside Elder Corvain's father, she said quietly. Before I held this seat myself, I was young then, Junior. I remember the season your father's match with a commoner woman quietly dissolved my king. I remember it because it happened with unusual speed, and because the pressure behind it was unusually coordinated for what was, on paper, a matter of personal choice rather than state policy. She looked at Corvain. I never named names, she said, because I had no proof, only impressions. But I remember your father's voice in council chambers, very much like this one, Elder Corvain, using very similar language about bloodline and stability. I remember thinking, even then, how convenient it was that objections could be raised and pressed without ever being formally recorded as coming from any one house in particular. Corvain's composure had thinned considerably by now, though he was fighting to hold what remained of it. Councilwoman Fentwick, he said with respect, impressions from decades past hardly constitute. I'm not finished, Fenwick said, and something in her tone made even Corvain fall silent. Because there's something else I remember, Elder Corvain, that I think this council should hear. 3 years ago, when King Aldrich died and his son inherited the throne, you came to me privately. Do you remember that conversation? Corvain said nothing. You expressed concern, Fenwick continued, that the new king might prove, your word, I believe, sentiment, prone to decisions driven by personal attachment rather than pragmatic governance. You asked whether I would support intervention, should such a situation arise. I told you I would need to see the specifics of any such situation before committing to anything. I assumed, at the time, this was ordinary council caution. She looked at the knife on the table at the raven sigil catching the light. Understand now, she said, that you were asking whether I would help you do again what your father apparently helped do 23 years ago. The chamber had gone utterly silent. Corvain sat very still, his hands flat on the table before him. And for the first time all morning, Senna watched something genuine move across his face, not simple guilt. Something closer to the particular fury of a man who has spent decades building a careful structure and is now watching it collapse in a single conversation he hadn't fully anticipated. Everything I've done, he said finally, voice tight, controlled, I've done for the stability of this kingdom. 3 centuries of governance built on the certainty of bloodline. You would have me apologize for protecting that. You would have your king marry a woman he doesn't love, Rurik said, to protect an argument that exists solely to keep your family relevant on this council. That's not stability, Elder Corvain. That's fear wearing the mask of tradition. Fear, Corvain repeated, something bitter twisting through the word. You think this is fear? I watched what happened to kingdoms that let sentiment override structure. I watched houses fall because a ruler chose feeling over duty. I have spent my entire life ensuring Blackthorn never must those cautionary tales, and in the process, Senna said quietly, you tried to have me killed. Corvain looked at her then, really looked for the first time in the entire confrontation, something almost like genuine consideration crossing his face. That, he said slowly, was not my intention. Explain it then, Rurik said. Explain the knife. Explain the steward. Explain your own words, 23 years old. Describing appropriate pressure applied to my father's match. Corvain was quiet for a long moment. I intended a fall, he said finally. An accident embarrassing enough to raise doubt about the match without genuine harm. The groom I engaged was instructed to weaken the strap, not sever it entirely. If the cut went deeper than intended, he stopped. Something flickered across his face that might, in a different man, have resembled regret. That was not by my design. Design or not, Rurik said, she could have died. That's the outcome your carelessness nearly produced. Councilwoman Fenwick spoke again, her voice carrying easily across the now silent chamber. I move, she said, that this council formally strip Elder Corvain of his seat pending full investigation into both this incident and the events of 23 years past. I further move that all evidence presented here today, the knife, the steward's testimony, King Aldrich's own list, and the council minutes from 23 years ago, be entered into permanent record. Second, it said another council member, a younger man Senna didn't recognize, who had remained silent through the check changed until now. The vote that followed was swift, 10 in favor, 1 abstention. Corvain predictably voting against his own censure, a final gesture of defiance that changed nothing. Guards moved to his side. He rose slowly, with what dignity remained available to a man who had just watched 20 years of careful influence dissolve inside a single morning. He paused brief, in front of Senna, on his way out of the chamber. You should know, he said quietly, so only she could hear, that I was not the only one who believed as I did. Removing me from this council does not remove the belief itself, it only removes its most visible face. He was led out. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment afterward, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over the assembled council like dust after a collapse. Senna felt strangely hollow. Not the triumph she'd half expected. Something closer to a held breath she hadn't yet found permission to release. But Corvain's final words followed her out of that chamber like a shadow she couldn't quite outrun. I was not the only one who believed as I did. Because that meant this wasn't finished. Because that meant somewhere within this same council, within this same kingdom, other people carried the same quotatfitinch that had driven a man to nearly kill her over a matter of bloodline. Because removing one architect didn't dismantle the structure he'd built. It only removed the hand currently holding the blueprints. Which meant whatever came next, the formal claiming, the public ceremony, the life she was choosing inside's walls, would have to be built in full view of people who might still quietly believe she didn't belong there. That evening, Isolde found her again in the library. You look like a woman who won a battle and lost her appetite for the war, Isolde said. That's about right. He wasn't wrong. Isolde, settling into the chair across from her, Rurik's, though neither of them mentioned that. About not being alone, there will be others. Quiet ones. The kind who never sign their name. Who never carry a knife themselves, who simply nod along when someone else does the dangerous work. That's a comforting thought. I'm not offering comfort, Isolde said. I'm offering honesty. I spent my whole life inside a belief system I've only just started questioning. I promise you, Senna, there are others in this kingdom who haven't started questioning it yet at all. Senna was quiet for a moment. Then I suppose, she said finally, the claiming needs to mean something more than a ceremony. If people are still going to look at me and see a problem to be solved rather than a person to be accepted, then whatever happens next needs to answer that directly. Not just repeat old words in front of a crowd. It settled. Something shifted in Isolde's expression, approval maybe. Or recognition. That, she said, sounds like the beginning of a plan. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Ashvale. Senna recognized her mother's handwriting on the outer fold before she'd even broken the seal, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of it. Anticipation and dread tangled together so thoroughly she couldn't separate one from the other. She read it alone in her chamber, by the light of a single candle. My daughter, I have carried this so long I hardly know how to begin setting it down. His name was Aldrich. I never told you because the pain of it never fully closed, not in 23 years, and I told myself protecting you from that pain was a kindness. I understand now it was also a kind of cowardice. I loved him. Or the beginning of loving him. Before the council made certain there wouldn't be more of it than a beginning. They didn't send soldiers. They didn't need to. They sent pressure instead. Quiet threats to my family. Whispered warnings about what would happen to a commoner woman foolish enough to imagine herself worthy of a throne. I withdrew before he was forced to choose between me and his crown, because I understood even at 19 that the choice would destroy him either way, and I couldn't bear to be the reason. I married twice after. Both times, I chose men I thought might let me forget him. Neither marriage survived the comparison, though I never told either husband why. That failure was mine to carry, not theirs to be blamed for. I am coming to Blackthorn, Senna. I should have come the moment your letter arrived. I am ashamed it took me this long to find the courage. Your mother, Isolde. Senna sat with the letter for a long time after finishing it, the candle burning lower beside her, the fortress settling into its nighttime quiet around her. 23 years of silence. 23 years of a woman carrying a grief so heavy, she couldn't set it down even for her own daughter, couldn't risk the words leaving her mouth even in the privacy of their small cottage in Ashvale. Senna understood it now. Understood the strange, sudden departures from rooms whenever the subject of her father arose. Understood the particular quality of sadness that had always seemed to live somewhere behind her mother's eyes, present even in her happiest moments, like a shadow that never fully lifted. She found Rurik in the library as she'd known she would, and handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly. When he finished, he sat for a long moment in paper resting in his hands. She loved him, he said finally. Quietly. Genuinely. She still does, Senna said. 23 years, 2 marriages, and she still does. I could hear it in every line. My father never remarried after my mother died, Rurik said. I always assumed it was grief for her. I wonder now if it wasn't something else entirely. Something he never let himself name. Isolde arrived at Blackthorn 3 days later. Senna watched from the same upper window where she'd once watched Isolde's procession ride away in exile, and felt an entirely different kind of tension coiling in her chest as her mother's modest cart came into view through the gate. She went down to meet her in the courtyard. Didn't wait for formality, didn't wait for Garrick or any ceremonial escort, simply crossed the stones at something close to a run and folded her mother into an embrace that neither of them seemed willing to end. I'm sorry, Isolde said into her daughter's shoulder. I'm sorry it took a crisis to make me brave enough to say any of it. You're here now, Senna said. That's what matters. Rurik approached slowly, giving them the moment they needed before extending his own greeting. When Isolde finally straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of one hand, and looked up at him properly for the first time, something passed across her face that Senna would remember for the rest of her life. Recognition. Not of Rurik himself, she'd never met him before this moment, but of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the particular quality of stillness he carried so unmistakably his father's that Isolde's breath caught audibly in her throat. You have his eyes, she said softly. I'd forgotten how much that could still undo a person. They spoke for hours that evening, the three of them together in the library, the same room that had become, over these strange weeks, the true heart of everything that mattered at Blackthorn. Isolde told them what she remembered of Aldrich, not the king the histories recorded, but the young man she'd known before the crown had fully settled its weight on him. His laugh, which apparently came rarely but completely when it did. His habit of reading late into the night by candlelight in this very room, the same eastern windows, the same worn oak table. He used to say, Isolde said, that the crown wasn't the hard part of ruling. The hard part was remembering, every single day, that the people around you had their own hearts, their own reasons, separate from whatever the crown needed from them. He worried, even then, that he'd forget that eventually. That the throne would wear him down into someone who only saw duty. She looked at Rurik. I think, in the end, the council made certain he became exactly that, she said. I think losing me was the moment he stopped trusting his own heart at all, and started letting other men's fears make his decisions for him. Rurik was quiet for a long moment. I don't intend to make the same mistake, he said finally. Whatever else happens, whatever counsel remains to pressure, I don't intend to let for finish what it had started with my father. That night, alone in the library, after Isolde had retired to the chamber prepared for her, Senna and Rurik sat together in a quiet that had somewhere over these strange weeks become entirely comfortable. "Corvain's gone," she said finally, "but he wasn't wrong. About not being alone. Agreed. He wasn't, so what happens now?" Rurik was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. "The claiming can't just be a ceremony anymore," he said slowly. "Not after everything that surfaced. If I stand up in front of this court and simply repeat old words, I'm telling every quiet Corvain sympathizer left on that council that nothing has actually changed. That the structure survives even when one man who built part of it doesn't. Then what?" "Then I think," Rurik said, "the claiming needs to become something else, not just a declaration that I choose you. A reckoning. Complete. Everything laid bare in front of the whole court, the way it was laid bare in that council chamber. Except this time in front of everyone who'll ever question whether you belong here." She felt something steady settle in her chest, hearing that. Not relief exactly. Something closer to readiness. "That's going to make enemies," she said. "People who'd have preferred this stayed quiet, tucked away in a council chamber where they didn't have to watch it happen." Rurik said. "I spent 3 years wondering why my father let fear write the ending of his own story. I'm not going to spend the rest of mine making the same mistake in front of the same audience." The days that followed moved with a different energy than the weeks before them. Less reactive. Less defensive. Shaped now by intention rather than crisis. Preparations for the formal began in earnest. Not the quiet, understated affair Senna had initially imagined, but something larger, more deliberate, an occasion designed, Rurik made clear to everyone involved in arranging it. Not simply celebrate a match, but to answer publicly and completely every question that had shadowed these weeks. Isolde, to Senna's genuine surprise, threw herself into the preparations with an energy that looked almost like penitence. "I know the court better than anyone currently at Blackthorn who isn't hostile to you," Isolde said when Senna asked why. "Let me use that for something worth using it for once." Isolde remained at Blackthorn, settling slowly into a rhythm that seemed, day by day, to lift some long-carried weight from her shoulders. She and Rurik spent hours together in the library, Isolde sharing memories of Aldrich that Rurik had never had access to. Rurik filling in the shape of the man his father had become in the years after Isolde's departure, a portrait neither of them could have completed alone. But beneath the preparations, a quieter tension remained. Corvain's final words continued in Senna's mind, refusing to settle. "I was not the only one who believed as I did." She raised it with Garrick one evening, the two of them alone in the guardroom, the knife with its Ravo's sigil resting in its locked cabinet nearby. "Have you found anyone else?" she asked, "since Corvain's censure? Any sign of who else might have shared his views?" Garrick was quiet for a moment. "There have been whispers," he admitted. "Nothing solid. A few council members who voted for his censure with less enthusiasm than the rest. A groom in the stables who resigned suddenly without explanation, 2 days after Dressler's confession became known." "You think he was involved?" the groom Corvain mentioned. "I think it's possible," Garrick said. "I think we may never prove it conclusively. Some threads once cut simply disappear into the larger fabric of a household this size. That doesn't mean the thread is gone, it means it's gone quiet." Senna absorbed that for a long moment. "Then the claiming needs to be more than symbolic," she said, echoing what she and Rurik had discussed days earlier. "It needs to close the door hard enough that whoever's left doesn't imagine there's still a gap to slip through." The night before the formal claiming, Senna couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire in her chamber, the copper coin, both of them now, hers and the one Rurik had returned to her in that first anteroom conversation, resting in her palm, turning them over slowly in the firelight. So much had happened since that first night at the gate. A test she hadn't known she was taking. A list she hadn't known existed. 23 years deep finally dragged into the light. A mother's grief, finally spoken aloud after 2 decades of silence. Tomorrow, all of it would culminate in front of the entire court. Not just a declaration of love, but a public reckoning with everything that had tried to prevent it. She thought about her mother, 19 years old, choosing silence to protect a man she loved from an impossible choice. She thought about how much that silence had cost both of them, stretched out across 23 years, a wound that had never fully closed because it had never been allowed to heal properly in the open air. She thought about Corvain's final words, still circling. "I was not the only one who believed as I did." Tomorrow, she decided, watching the firelight catch the worn copper in her palm, she would give whoever remained exactly what Corvain had feared most. Not a quiet ceremony they could tolerate and forget. A truth they could never again pretend not to have. Morning came. Too fast. It always does before the days that matter most. Senna woke before the light fully cleared the eastern windows, and for one long disoriented moment she didn't remember why her chest felt so tight. Then she remembered. Today. The great hall was already stirring by the time she rose. She could hear it through the stone footsteps' voices, the particular hum of a fortress preparing for something it wouldn't forget. Servants carrying garlands. A wheel cart creaking somewhere below her window. Hauling benches into position, she dressed slowly. Deep gray wool, the same color she'd worn the last time she stood in front of this court, because she'd decided, sometime in the sleepless hours before dawn, that she wasn't going to borrow anyone else's colors for this. Not green. Not gold. Just her own. The copper coin went into the small pocket sewn at her breast, both of them, now hers and the one he'd returned. She looked at herself in the narrow mirror for a long moment. Because this wasn't going to be a wedding, not really. Weddings are quiet things, private things, dressed up for show but built for two people. This was going to be a trial, hers, his. His father's 23 years dead and still somehow standing in the room. Her mother's waiting downstairs with hands that hadn't stopped trembling since she arrived. All of it laid bare. In front of everyone she took a breath. "Let's go," she told the mirror. The mirror didn't answer. Mirrors never do. But her reflection straightened its spine anyway, and that was enough. The great hall was fuller than Senna had ever seen it. Every house with standing at Blackthorn had sent someone. Some had sent everyone. The tapestry at the far wall, the black wolf, jaws open, standing over its broken crown, seemed to loom larger than usual. Or maybe that was just her own nerves, stretching the room out of proportion. She found Iseult near the entrance, standing very still in a borrowed blue dress, hands folded so tightly together the knuckles had gone pale. "You don't have to be here," Senna said quietly. "If it's too much, I've spent 23 years being somewhere else," Iseult said. "I'm done with that." Iseult appeared at Senna's other side, dressed simply today, no iron rings, no heritage pendant, just plain dark wool that made her look, oddly, more like herself than Senna had ever seen her look before. "Ready?" Iseult said. "Neither was I. The day I actually became honest about anything. Doesn't stop the day from happening anyway." Senna almost laughed, almost. She didn't have the breath to spare for it, the council already seated when she entered. All 11 who remained, Corvain's chair empty at the center, the raven still carved into the wood behind it like a wound that hadn't finished healing. Councilwoman Fenwick sat near the front, her sharp eyes finding Senna's the moment she crossed the threshold. A small nod. Nothing more. But it steadied something in Senna's chest anyway. Rurik stood at the front near the wolf throne, dressed in black, the thin iron circlet on his head that she'd only seen him wear once before. He didn't sit, didn't move toward the throne at all. He watched her walk the length of the hall. The same walk she'd made in the weeks since, hood up, eyes down, trying to disappear before anyone noticed her, on that very first night. She didn't try to disappear this time, she stopped 3 paces as before. Some things apparently repeated themselves whether you meant them to or not. "You look terrified," he said quietly. For her ears only, "I am terrified." "Good," he said. "So am I." He turned to face the court. "Weeks ago," he said, and his voice carried easily to every corner of that enormous room without ever seeming to rise, "I sat at my own gate dressed as a beggar. I wanted to know whether a woman I'd never spoken to would treat a stranger with kindness when she believed nothing was watching, and nothing was owed to her in return." Silence. "Absolute she did," Rurik said. "She gave me her last coin, told me it was for my trouble. I have carried that coin in my pocket every day since." He produced it. Held it up. The court could see the worn copper catching torchlight. "But that is not the story I've come to tell you today," he said, "because a kindness at a gate is a small thing however much it moved me. What I've learned since is not small at all. 23 years ago," he said, "my father loved a woman named Iseult, a commoner. His wolf chose her the way my wolf chose Senna, without asking permission, without consulting bloodlines. The way a wolf's choosing has always worked, long before any council decided it needed correcting." A murmur moved through the hall. Small, immediate. "The council destroyed that match," Rurik said, quietly, through pressure no one was meant to trace. "My father spent the rest of his life carrying a grief he never spoke aloud, not even to his own son, and I inherited a throne from a man I only partially understood, because half of him had been carved away before I was old enough to know what was missing." He gestured, and Garrick stepped forward, carrying the folder, the old list, the council minutes, everything they'd assembled over the past. "This is not accusation without proof," Rurik said. "This is my father's own hand, his own list. His own uncrossed choice, left standing at the bottom of a page for 23 years waiting for someone brave enough to finally ask why." He set the folder on a small table positioned at the front of the dais, open for anyone in the front rows to see. Days before this ceremony, he continued, someone cut the girth strap on Senna's saddle during the ceremonial hunt. She fell, she could have died. The evidence, a knife, a steward's confession. Council minutes. 23 years old, led this council to Elder Corvain, who has now been stripped of his seat pending full investigation. He paused. Let that settle. But Corvain himself told me something, on his way out of that chamber, that I have not been able to stop thinking about since, Rick said. He said he was not the only one who believed as he did. The silence in the hall shifted, sharpened. Senna could feel it, the particular quality of a room realizing it was about to be asked a question it had hoped to avoid. So I am asking today, Rurik said, in front of this entire court, exactly what I should have asked my father's council 23 years ago, and didn't have the chance to because I wasn't yet born to ask it. He looked out across the assembled houses, slowly, deliberately, giving every face in that hall the uncomfortable sensation of being looked at directly. Is there anyone else in this hall, he said, who believes as Elder Corvain believed, that the woman standing beside me is unworthy of this throne because of the blood in her veins? Anyone who shares his conviction, even if they never touched a knife, even if their hands remain clean while other hands did the work. Nobody spoke. Which was, Senna understood exactly the answer Corvain had promised. The quiet ones. The ones who never signed their names to anything. I didn't expect an answer, Rurik said, after the silence had stretched long enough to make its own point. Men who hide behind other men's hands rarely step forward when asked directly. But I want it understood by everyone in this hall that the silence itself is now on record. That if harm comes to this woman, now or in a year or in tens, this court will remember that the question was asked plainly, and no one answered it honestly. He turned back to Senna. Something in his face had softened, the weight of the public reckoning giving way for just a moment to something smaller. Something only the two of them shared. I told you once, he said, quieter now, that I had carried a coin for you before I even understood why. I want to finish that thought properly, this time, in front of everyone, instead of alone in an anteroom where no one else could hear it. He reached into his coat, produced a second coin, new uncirculated, catching the light in a way old one never could. I've ruled Blackthorn for 9 years, he said. In that time I have been offered gold alliances. Bloodlines the council considered impeccable. I have never since, in 9 years, been offered something for my trouble by a woman who didn't know who I was. He stepped forward, closed the distance between them entirely. This is the most valuable thing I own, he said, holding the coin where the whole hall could see it. I am giving it to you tonight, in front of everyone who has ever doubted whether you belonged here, because I want every person in this hall to understand exactly what I've chosen. He placed it in her palm. Not the rank, he said. Not the bloodline the council spent decades pretending mattered more than a person's heart. Her. His hand closed around hers for the length of a single breath. He bent not far, just enough, and said something quiet against the top of her hair. Words meant only for her, words she would keep for the rest of her life and never repeat to another living soul. What she felt, in that moment, was not what she'd expected walking into the hall that morning. It was recognition, the strange, simple thing of a door opening in a wall she hadn't fully known she'd spent her whole life leaning against. When she lifted her face, he kissed her once briefly, in front of the entire court. The hall didn't stay quiet through that. Somewhere near the back someone started clapping. Garrick, she'd learn later, unable to maintain his usual composed reserve for even one more second, and the sound spread through the room like something catching fire. Applause and cheering and, here and there, the unmistakable sound of someone weeping openly. Isolt was one of them. Senna could see her, near the entrance, tears streaming freely down a face that had spent 23 years learning to hide exactly this kind of feeling. The formal ceremony that followed was almost quiet. By comparison, the ritual words, the exchange of vows before the councils, the small formalities pack law required. Senna barely remembered most of it afterward. What she remembered clearly, what she would remember for the rest of her life, was the moment before it. The coin. The silence after his question to the hall, the particular quality of a room learning, all at once, that something had fundamentally changed in how power would be exercised at Blackthorn from that day forward. Elder Corvain's formal investigation concluded 3 weeks later. He was stripped entirely of his title and holdings, his family's council seat suspended for a generation, pending review by a committee councilwoman Fenwick had insisted on chairing personally. He wasn't imprisoned. The evidence, while substantial, didn't rise to a level the council's own laws required for that severity of punishment, and Rurik, to Senna's quiet surprise, didn't push for it. Why not? She asked him. the evening the ruling came down, because making him a martyr serves his cause better than making him irrelevant, Rurik said. A man in prison becomes a story people whisper sympathetically. A man stripped of everything and left to watch the kingdom move forward without him becomes a warning nobody needs to whisper about at all. Isolde's own standing recovered slowly deliberately over the following months. She wasn't restored to the position she'd once held. That would have required a kind of forgetting Senna wasn't willing to extend, not fully, not after the lineage writ and everything it had nearly cost. But Isolde's honesty in the council chamber, her willingness to name her own family's complicity in shielding Corvain's schemes, earned her something else, a slower rebuilding. A seat further from the center of power, but real and hers, and honestly earned this time instead of inherited. It's not what I had before, Isolde admitted to Senna one afternoon. Months later, the two of them walked the Eastern Gallery together. An odd friendship formed in the wreckage of what should have been permanent enmity, but real nonetheless. No, Senna agreed. It's better. You built this one yourself, considered that for a moment. I suppose I did. Dressler the steward was released from Corvain's household entirely. His testimony weighed as mitigating circumstance rather than criminal participation. He found work eventually in a modest trading house 2 villages north. Ordinary work, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of quiet life a man carries gratefully after nearly being crushed by someone else's ambition. Isolde stayed at Blackthorn through the winter. Senna watched her mother slowly unclench over those months, watched the particular tightness she'd carried in her shoulders for as long as Senna could remember gradually ease, watched her laugh more freely, watched her spend long afternoons in the library with Rurik, trading stories about a man neither of them had ever fully understood alone. He would have liked you, Isolde told Rurik once. Senna listening quietly from the window seat. Not the king you've become. The boy I imagine you were before the crown taught you to hide things. I still hide things, Rurik said. I'm working on it. Slowly, Isolde said. Slowly, he agreed. But working Tobin arrived in early spring. Well enough finally to travel, his headcough reduced to an occasional complaint rather than the constant rattle that had once kept his mother awake through long nights of worry. He took one look at the size of Blackthorn's kitchens and declared within the hour that he had found his true calling in life. The cook, a broad woman named Mabel who ran her domain with the precision of a small military campaign, took one look at Tobin's enthusiasm and put him to work peeling vegetables. Before he'd finished unpacking his bags, he didn't complain. Senna watched him from the doorway, flour already dusted across one cheek, laughing at something Mabel had, and felt something in her chest ease that she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel in months. Peace. Actual uncomplicated peace. One quiet afternoon in early spring, Rick took Senna down to the stables himself. No guards, no ceremony, just the two of them, and the smell of hay and horse, and the particular gray light of a sky that couldn't decide gray whether to rain. Ash was waiting in her stall, ears pricking forward the moment she recognized footsteps. There's something I never finished telling you, Rurik said, running a hand along the mare's neck about her. The stable boy told me once that she belonged to your sister. Rurik was quiet for a moment. Her name was Wren, he said. My sister, she was 19 when she died. A fever, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could have prevented, though I spent a long time afterward believing otherwise. Ash was hers before she was anyone's. Gentlest animal in this stable, because Wren trained her that way. Patient, never spooked. My sister used to say a good horse should be brave enough to carry someone who's frightened. Senna felt something tighten in her throat. You gave her to me. I gave you the gentlest thing I owned, Rurik said. Because I was terrified, that first week, of everything that could go wrong. And some part of me needed you carried by something that had already proven it could hold someone safely through hard things. And when the strap was cut, he said quietly, I thought for about half a second, standing over you on that frozen ground, that I'd made the same mistake twice, given someone I loved to a kindness that couldn't protect them after all. She didn't fail, Senna said. Ash didn't panic. She held still. She gave me the half second I needed to understand what was happening. Rurik looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. She didn't fail. Neither of you did. He pressed his forehead briefly against Ash's, the way Senna imagined he might have done as a much younger man in a much different life, before any of this had happened to any of them. Wren would have liked you, he said finally. She had no patience for people who mistook softness for weakness. I think she'd have found it very funny, actually, that her horse ended up carrying the woman who finally cracked this whole rotten structure open. Scent reached out and stroked the mare's nose, the two of them standing together in the quiet, and something settled fully into place that had been circling, unfinished, since that first cold morning on the hunt. Spring gave way to summer and Blackthorn settled into a rhythm Senna hadn't quite dared imagine, back when she was standing at that gate with her last coin in her hand. The council, reshaped by Corvain's absence and Fenwick's steady leadership, moved slowly toward reforms neither Rurik nor Senna had originally planned to pursue, but which felt, once the momentum started, like the only honest response to everything that had been uncovered: a formal review of lineage law. Not abolition, pack stability still mattered, and Rurik was careful never to pretend otherwise, but as something of rigid certainty that had allowed men like Corvain to weaponize bloodline as a tool of control rather than a genuine matter of pack cohesion. It won't fix everything, Fenwick told Senna, the two of them walking the lower courtyard one warm evening in early summer. There will always be someone who believes blood matters more than character. You can't legislate that kind of fear out of people entirely. No, Senna agreed. But you can make it harder for them to act on it quietly. That matters too, it does, Fenwick said. More than most people realize, until they've watched what happens when quiet fear goes unchecked for 23 years. The library remained, through all of it, the true center of Senna's life at Blackthorn. She spent long mornings there, the eastern sun pouring across the same worn oak table, where she'd first seen her name uncrossed on a list of 46, where she'd first learned the shape of the conspiracy that had shadowed 2 generations of her family. She began writing, eventually, first small things, notes to herself, attempts to make sense of everything that had happened in those strange tumbling weeks. Then something larger. A full account start to finish. The story of a woman who hadn't meant to give a beggar her last coin, and had ended up somehow rewriting the fate of an entire kingdom's council in the process. She was working on it one afternoon deep in the library's warm quiet, when Rurik came in from the training yard, still faintly dusty from whatever exercise had occupied his morning. He paused in the doorway, watched her for a moment before she noticed him. "What are you writing?" he asked finally. She said, not looking up. "About a man I once mistook for a beggar." He crossed the room, sat across from her, in the chair that had become, over these months, his. "Will you tell them about the coin?" he asked. "I'll tell them everything. Even the part in the anteroom, where I told you I owed you a coin and you looked at me like you were deciding whether to laugh or run. Especially that part. And the part where my father's list nearly undid an entire council. That part too," Senna said. "Someone should know. Somewhere someday someone might need to know that quiet fear can build something this dangerous if nobody ever asks the question out loud." Rurik was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she'd come to recognize over these months. Something between amusement and something far deeper. Something that still, even now, seemed to catch him faintly by surprise every time it surfaced. "Tell them," he said finally, "that I was not entirely sorry to be mistaken." Beggar, he stood, crossed to the door, paused there, the late afternoon light catching the side of his face, and for a moment Senna saw unmistakably the echo of his father's portrait in the eastern gallery. The same jaw, the same quiet gravity, carried now by a man who had chosen, deliberately, not to let fear finish writing his story the way it had finished his father's. "I love you." Simple, unadorned. The way he said most things that mattered most. "I know," Senna said. "You carried a coin in your pocket for 3 hours to prove it before you even had the words." He smiled, full and unguarded, the kind the old stories claimed he never gave in public. But this wasn't public. This was just the library. Just the two of them. Just the quiet, ordinary miracle of an afternoon that didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He crossed back to where she sat, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the same gesture from the day of the claiming. Except this one asked for nothing, promised nothing, was simply itself. Then he closed the door behind him gently, the way he closed all doors now, like there was something inside worth keeping safe. Senna sat alone for a while after he left, the pen still in her hand, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the old oak table. She thought about her mother, 19 years old, choosing silence to protect a love she believed impossible to survive. She thought about a man sitting in the mud outside his own gate, testing a kingdom's worth of strangers for a single moment of unguarded kindness. She thought about a knife with a raven's sigil, and a steward's trembling confession, and a councilwoman brave enough to speak a truth she'd carried silently for decades. She thought about a gentle gray mare who had once belonged to a girl who never got to grow old, and who had carried, without knowing it, the whole weight of a second chance. She thought, most of all, about the 2 copper coins resting now in a small carved box on the mantel of the chamber she shared with Rurik, worn, ordinary, worth almost nothing, by any measure a merchant would recognize. And worth, she understood now, more than the entire treasury of Blackthorn combined. Because they weren't coins anymore. Hadn't been coins for a long time, they were proof that kindness offered without calculation could still, somehow, against every fear and every quiet conspiracy built to prevent it, find its way home. She picked up her
One last
time and wrote a single closing line, the only one the account needed. I did not mean to give him the coin. I am glad every single day since that I did. She set the pen down, blew out the candle, and went to find the man who was still, after everything, learning how to let a door stay open.